Chapter 19. Nyc. I answered the phone. Valencia? Oh, please, just call me Val. I keep looking for my mother when you call me that. Her voice sounded like she was trying to be light and dismissive, but the tension behind her words pulled it tighter and tauter than I expected. I'm going to put you on speakerphone so Stel can hear. I take it you found something? I laid the phone on the table and clicked the speaker button. That's fine. Her voice came out tinny, but the stress was still clear in her words. So, yeah, you could say that. I hate this. All of it. Everyone has been given orders to monitor their phones for an emergency alert. If anyone else is targeted, they want to warn everyone. It's like an Amber Alert, but for dual agents. She sucked in a breath of air. Sorry, in babble mode. It is not a problem, my dear Val. I can only begin to imagine how extraordinarily difficult this must be for you. Stel leaned forward as he spoke, his voice conveying more comfort and understanding than I could in an hour of talking. I really needed to punch something. That was where my strength lay. Yes, well, here's what I found. I called Mariah and boy, she came fast. She's still spitting mad. She said this was not how she planned or had seen herself dying, muttered about the promise being broken, though I'm really not sure what she meant by that. Anyhow, she pulled in a deep breath of air, and then there were slurping sounds. A drink, I guessed. Either way, she sounded more focused when she came back on the line. Bottom line, they stopped at the rest stop to take some pictures of the falls, stretch their legs. They were just standing there when some older guy walked up. Mariah had a hard time describing him because he was just so normal. Her words, not mine. There was like nothing that jumped out until he spoke. She paused and took another swallow of something. The avoidance made the hairs on my skin rise up. I knew it wouldn't be good. This won't be like suffocating under snow, but it'll be close enough. Her words weren't done in her normal tone, but in a throaty creak of words that carried more weight than you would have thought. Val coughed a bit. Then she said both of them couldn't breathe. They tried to, but nothing was there. No matter how hard they struggled, the guy stood there until they died, and he said something to them, then looked at them, and freaked out, racing away. The moments between life and death aren't super clear, but Mariah thinks he ran into traffic or something. That is the last she really remembers. I just stared at the phone for a moment, my mind locked on the idea of trying to breathe and there being no oxygen at all. It sounded like a horrible, painful way to die. What did he say? I asked, almost scared of the answer. Mariah can't swear to it, but she thought he said, "Frostbite kills bit by bit. Soon Alder will understand." Stel spoke up. Val, did Mariah say she recognized the man at all? Or maybe his speech patterns? Nah, or at least not that she said. I couldn't hold her long. Burl had already gone, but she was waiting to see if we would reach out. That's all I got. Val sounded dejected, but I just nodded. Thanks, Val. This helps a lot. I wasn't sure if it actually did help, but it was more information, and Stel was already adding the message there. Nah, thanks. Let me say goodbye to her. I owe ya. See you late. She hung up before I could say anything else. I looked at Stel. This really does point back to that issue with Victor and Jane. I know. I'm going to send Moxie an email. I don't think she's up to talking right now. I want to know if anyone was killed besides our people on each of those days, and if any of them resembled the people we saw. He frowned. Now that I think about it, we need to know what the crime scene people found. Eat more sugar first. I pushed one of the leftover muffins his way, and he ate it almost without noticing. I rose and started pacing back and forth. If I was staging this, if there were people I wanted to kill and I knew their addresses, why not just snipe them? Personal. This person wants it personal. But is it for the killer or the victims? Stel stopped his typing and picked up the sheet with the employees. Emily wasn't working for Duo when all that went down. Only a few people were. Either we talk to Rat and Jeannie or we wait for the crime scene techs. Both. I pulled up the number listed for both of them and dialed. I hated waiting around for things that I could just make happen, up to and including starting a woman's labor. The phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail with a message that the box was full. I sighed and hung up. They did not answer. Stel looked at me, a flash of concern on his face. No, which could mean nothing. I shrugged. Whatever rat and genie were dealing with, I could not help. He gave me a funny look, then sighed. We need to locate the dead bodies. This time I cast him the funny look. Hasn't that been done? We know about the agents, but I have a very strong suspicion that the people, the puppets he or she is using to kill people, do not remain breathing very long after their victims are dead. We need to find them. Moxie? It was the only thing I could think of. No, I asked, and she said if they haven't been fully logged into the federal system, she can't find them. The only reason she even knew about the agents was that their fingerprints are registered as agents, and HQ is always notified if any of our fingerprints show up in a search. That made sense now that he said it, but it didn't tell me much of where to go next. So, what now? Now, we need to head to the Portland Police Department and hope that our badges will open some doors and help us get the info we need. I had no reason to not go with him. We changed clothes and headed out, though Stel stopped right before we walked out the door. When we head out, don't look at the camera. Pretend it isn't there. We acting as bait? I was curious because I wanted to know which weapons to grab for, more than anything else. Yes, no, maybe. Mostly I'm trying to see if anyone reacts, or if it's just another false lead in this case. I pasted on a smile as we walked out, then turned, heading to the police headquarters off of 2nd Street, where if we were lucky, there might be some answers. They weren't even a mile away, so we agreed to walk, both to see the area and stretch our legs. For me, the walk was nice, the weather cool and crisp, but Stel huffed a bit, trying to keep up with my pace. Either way, we didn't really talk, spending more time looking at the town and trying to figure out if we were being followed or if someone else was paying attention to us. Nothing jumped out at me, and stalkers were easier to see than most people thought. We walked up the steps to the station, showed our badges to the desk officer. The badges thing still was neat to me. Then waited. 15 minutes later, someone ushered us into a conference room. Stel sat, but I gave the chairs a dubious look and decided to stand. They looked like chairs that should have been recycled 3 decades ago or donated to a museum. I had a strong feeling that they would crack under my bulk. It's all muscle, Stel murmured. I flashed a glance at him, confused, but I didn't have time to think about anything else before the door opened and a man in a suit walked in. If it wasn't that I was sure he was not a magical creature, I would have pegged him as such. There was something powerful about his bearing and his gaze, as if he could see through my glamour. With dark hair clipped short, a hawk-like nose, and dark brown eyes, he could have melted into the crowd on multiple continents, but I knew he was native to this area. You're in the agents? I just nodded while Stel started his soothing talking. Yes, we are following up on the bodies we found earlier today. I know it is unlikely that a cause of death has been determined, but we are wondering if there was anything else odd. The man grunted. Joseph Tell and Detective. Homicide. They were murdered, we think. If the house had not been so obviously untouched, it might have been written off as a freak animal accident. What? The words burst out of my mouth before I could restrain them. If possible, could you elaborate on that statement? Stel smoothed over my bluntness to my relief. If the cops didn't help us, my brand of intimidation wouldn't be much use. Joseph gave both of us a long look. The coroner hasn't released final findings, but his preliminary on the scene judgment was that some sort of animal killed them. Large, with large claws. But you still think it's murder? I was curious. Generally, that didn't lead to people thinking murder. Let's just assume it was a cougar. Not impossible. A large dog, or even a bear. All animals I've seen break into houses. However, if they had broken in, there should be signs around the house. Scratches, scat, knocked over objects, but there is nothing. If there weren't 2 dead bodies in the house with blatant signs of claws and bite marks, I'd say they died of something invisible, like carbon monoxide poisoning. Very interesting, Stel said, leaning back, his face smooth, giving nothing away. You know something? Joseph said, leaning forward. I want to know what it is. What is the status of the men that attacked us? Stel deflected the question, and it must have worked, because a strange look flickered over the detective's face. That is still under investigation, but we know one of them was killed by you. He narrowed his eyes at me. Why did you have a sword with you? I shrugged. I had left my cinquerea with them, and the space on my arm felt empty, but it would stay real, and I knew there was a chance I'd not get it back in one piece, but that was fine. I've been practicing for a stunt role in a movie. They need a double to do some of the fighting scenes. If I can pull off the moves, I might get the job. It slid off my tongue easily enough, though I disliked lying. But trying to explain how I could pull swords out of my tattoos was a no-go. Huh, another Conan movie? He asked as he dug through the file. Ugh, no. A Dungeons and Dragons movie. Main character is a female barbarian. At least wouldn't be boring, but I might not be big enough. His eyes flicked to me for a moment. Who's starring? No clue, but they want 6'11", and I'm only 6'9". I wasn't worried about my story. There was always movies being pitched, mapped out and abandoned. I'd seen enough of that when I filled in as a bodyguard for some of the actors. I'll keep my eyes out for it. Okay, here's another set of questions, and yes, I know you're agents, but that doesn't change my questions. Had you seen either of the men before? We both shook our heads no, and I was positive about that. I'd been tracking faces and body shapes, and no one that matched these men had been near us. Well, one of them is still in a coma, but the doctors say the thump on his head wasn't hard enough to do that. But the others are worse. Chapter 20. Stel. I was pretty sure I knew what was coming, but I simply focused my attention on Joseph and waited. He grunted sourly, but continued. The other two both died while in police custody, and that is making no one happy, as we can't find a cause of death. They're next on the coroner's list. Do you know of anything that could have contributed to this? Any signs of drug use? They're all former gang members, but dropped out of sight about 2 weeks ago. I shook my head as my mind raced. There was no way I could ask about the other suspects here. I'd have to follow up with Moxie. There was just too much information we did not possess. In all honesty, Detective, we walked out of the house, called our agency, and then they drove up and attacked. I do not recall them saying anything, or if they asked us to do anything, they simply pulled guns and knives. We defended ourselves. I shrugged, trying to imply helplessness. My small stature let me get away with it more than normal. Joseph looked thoughtful. That means they were watching the house for some reason. Drug deal gone bad? Something else? Those bodies were at least 3 weeks old at this point. That's a long time to be watching a house. I kept my face blank, but the detective had hit on something I'd missed. How had they known we were there? We needed to get back to the scene and look, see if we could figure that part out. I sorely regret that I must disappoint you. I was unaware of any surveillance, nor did we see any signs of some in the area until the ruffians arrived. Joseph's eyebrows quirked at my use of the word ruffians, but gangbanger was too passé. He snorted and looked down at his files. Basically, you don't know shit. You aren't going to tell me shit, and I have 3 dead men on my hands. His phone jangled the discordant note, and he picked it up. Yeah? He listened intently. Are you kidding me? From what? What do you mean they don't know? That is their entire job to know. His shoulders sagged, and he rubbed his forehead with his right hand. Yeah, I know. You're just the messenger. Just ask them to autopsy the body. We need to know this. He clicked the disconnect and stared at us. Make that 4 dead men. The coma guy coded 15 minutes ago, and the doctors have no clue as to why. Nyc sighed. I don't suppose you can at least harvest organs from him? I suspect it might be the only good thing he's ever done. I wish, but since we don't know who he is, we can't take his organs. Joseph looked like he wanted to spit on the ground. Nyc snorted, but didn't speak. Is it permissible for us to return to the scene? We'd like to investigate the area and see what else might have been there. The detective clenched his jaw but nodded as if something was forcing him. Tomorrow. It's getting late and we're almost done processing the scene. However, if you find anything, I expect you to share it. I don't like people getting killed or unexpectedly dying in my hometown. I nodded my head. Thank you. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. I don't suppose you have an idea about any of these men? Joseph shrugged. They're all in the system. 2 of them ran with the Bloods for a while. They hadn't been arrested since their 20s, and more than one officer thought they'd gotten out and gone straight. Apparently not. The other 2 were still on parole, but missed their last few check-ins. They weren't nice people, but brazen felony attempts like this seemed out of character. I didn't say anything. I was starting to suspect something, and I didn't like what was forming in my head. I don't suppose there's anything you can tell me. Joseph almost sounded desperate. Maybe why you were there? The badges we possessed carried with them a level of power that made my skin crawl. I'd be exceedingly careful to avoid abusing that power. They were simply fellow agents that had retired, and we wanted to talk to them regarding a case we were following. Their deaths are concerning. I chose my words carefully, but I wanted him to know it was probably murder like he thought. I see. Are other people at risk? Joseph seemed strangely intent as he asked me. No, I believe this was a personal or agency-related. I kept my voice calm. I didn't allow my gaze to shift from his face. The urge to tell him about the other victims and that the murders were linked pressed at my mind, but that seemed very unwise and would open up Duo to unwelcome levels of scrutiny. Joseph grunted and sank back. Will you tell me if the perpetrator is apprehended? Absolutely. That much I could promise in good conscience, as long as we didn't become victims. What about telling me about your agency? All I get is they have jurisdiction, nothing else. That doesn't sit well with me, not to mention both of you are much younger than the normal agents. His eyes were dark with frustration as they swept over us. Not to mention most agents from the other alphabet agencies don't look like you two. A morass of traps loomed like a hungry great white in front of me, but I needed to give him something to help explain it. We work for a sub-agency of Homeland, Duo, I said slowly. The badges had Duo on it, but not what the acronym stood for. There are not very many of us, probably less than 100. We don't look like normal agents because we aren't. We have very specific niche skills that are only rarely needed. This case is unusual, as we've never had our agents killed at home before. That was stretching the truth slightly, but not enough that I felt remorse. His eyes swept back and forth between us, and I could see him wanting to ask more questions. Just don't cause any more trouble. I don't like what I can't understand, and all I get with you and your duo are shadowy answers that obscure more than they reveal. If you find out anything that can help me get the killer, I expect you to let me know. I didn't tell him he'd never find the killer because if we found them first, they'd never be turned over to mortal law enforcement. Very well. Joseph stood and walked out of the room, taking the files with him. With that, we were ushered out, and I found myself standing on the street with Nyc. Do you think the first victims were an act of rage, or planned out like the others? Planned out, she answered almost instantly. Why do you think that? I tilted my head, waiting for her response. Chapter 21. Nyc. The air in Portland was cool, and I inhaled it as I tried to figure out how to explain what I sensed to Stel. When you get jumped, you flail around. There's frantic scrambling in your mind and body trying to find your balance. Even as a professional, there's a moment or two of trying to figure out how to react. We kept walking as I fumbled with the right words. If you kill someone, most people do it in the heat of the moment, in a fight, or something else going on. There's damage, things knocked over, scuff marks. To kill with no damage, Just the bodies? That implies a professional. Stel nodded as he walked.
I understand that concept, and it possesses the ring of logic. But what if there was a scuffle, and the killer had the presence of mind to clean up and obscure the damage?
I shrugged. Sure, but I'm pretty sure the crime scene techs will tell us, assuming it wasn't done in a magical manner. I kept walking, moving my head, scanning to see if anyone was following us.
I believe we need to request that Moxie investigate the other bodies, or if the bodies of the people being utilized as tools have appeared. I do wish Detective Joseph had been magical. The ability to inquire about any other bodies being discovered immediately after the other victims would be an advantage.
Stel sounded thoughtful. And maybe see if we can get all the case files the dead agents worked on, even the terminated ones and those that died on the job. This reeks of the past and has a stalker vibe. Those last words caused me to shudder. Stalkers were never good.
Stalker vibe? What does that imply?
Stel was paying too much attention to me, though that made my insides squirm, and not enough to his environment. Case in point, I had to pull him in front of me before he tripped over a homeless person laying on the sidewalk. Stalkers are obsessed. They care about every aspect of their focus's life. What they eat, who they see, their schedules. They want to absorb who that person was, is, and might become. Anyone with that intense of a focus is dangerous because all that matters is their object of affection. That was a longer sentence than I usually used, and the talking was wearing me out.
So, if this individual is stalking Alder, what indicators would there be?
It always amazed me when Stel listened to what I said. Even the other bodyguards, while they respected my strength, didn't put much stock in my words. I'm not sure we would, because I don't think this person is stalking Alder. I think he wants to destroy him, and that's a bit different. But it means they're going to know a lot about him and Duo.
Things only another agent would or should know?
He sounded pensive with that question. I would say yes, but surely the agents are trustworthy. I wanted to protest, but I also knew that everyone had a price. More than one bodyguard had failed at his job, because the bribe had been big enough.
I'm going to assume yes, but there are always family members, friends, or others that are affected by us. Just because they don't possess a direct connection to Duo does not guarantee they are not bearing a grudge based on the actions of Duo agents, or the outcomes of what a mission may have introduced.
Like the museum owner, once he found out we swapped the item. How much the original would have been worth, and that it was the fake had been discovered not 2 weeks after our mission, had been news on most channels for weeks. The owner had flipped out and tried to kill the person he'd bought it from.
Exactly. This is all centered around Duo, but this entire issue seems to have originated with Lester and Brian.
He had an excited tone to his voice, which means... I didn't know where he was going, but at least he had a path forward. I felt like I was stumbling around in the dark. Stel grinned up at me, the smile turning him from gorgeous to radiant.
It means you are accurate about the case files. We need to delve into what was going on that Lester and Brian were involved in, and who might have been hurt.
Moxie and Maven, then? It sounded like the best thing to me, if a bit boring. But there had to be a common link. At least that was what all the cop dramas said.
I believe that is best.
He paused on the sidewalk and pulled out his phone. After 3 minutes of rapid tapping on the screen, he slipped it back in his pocket.
I sent them an email, asking one of them to bring us all the case files involving any of the dead agents, and then all the other case files prior to Lester and Brian quitting.
We resumed our walk, though I was beginning to get hungry. That sounds good, but why that as the date?
They quit, but they were also the first killed that we have become aware of, so it stands that they are the key to this.
I nodded. It made sense to me.
I asked her to deliver the files to us in the Majestic, where I thought we might review what information they contained while in the bar, which also provides us with the ability to fortify ourselves.
He had a mischievous grin on his face. And why there? That made no sense to me. Not only was there the risk of getting food on the papers, but other people would see us looking at them.
Because it is highly likely the killer is someone that comes in and out of the Majestic, so us sitting there makes us prime targets if we are anywhere close to figuring out what is occurring.
Ah, us as bait.
As always, you see through my schemes.
He winked at me.
But there are a few advantages. It is improbable we will be attacked there. And it is reasonable to assume that anyone paying attention to us will be noticed. Besides, I asked for copies, not the original documents. That seems a bit risky.
Sounds good. I'm getting hungry. I glanced at my watch. It said 11:30.
Then let us eat, review files, then go back up to Lester and Brian's place.
Stel's smile lit up his face, and once again, I wished he was smiling for me like that. I pushed down the internal desire and just nodded. He took off at a brisk pace, and I followed. Even though he wasn't as tall as most, he carried himself in such a manner that all you saw was his essence. Very few men were as tall as me, and those that were tended to be trolls like Ikul. While I had no issue working with Ikul, he was excellent at stopping trouble before it started. I had zero desire to date him, or any other troll. They weren't the best at interactions, and dating to them was a club over the head. Stel seemed to have his mind elsewhere as he walked, and didn't talk as much as normal, but I didn't mind. I kept my eyes roaming and checking to see if anyone was following us. As we turned the street, rounding a building taller than most, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Learning how to surveil meant I didn't turn to look at it. Instead, I kept walking and would glance at a window or polished plaque in a wall. Portland seemed to have lots of historical markers, and verified it was still there. We made it back to Majestic, and neither of us even glanced at the camera as we entered. I turned as we entered the door, making it seem like I was making sure no humans were following us. But the drone that had been following us 4 blocks settled down on the roof of the building across the street. Chapter 22. Stel.
My mind was a whirl with thoughts, to the point that I didn't speak as we ambled back to the Majestic. There was information I needed to verify. Nick, can you grab us a table? I'll be back down in a moment. A booth, so we have the ability to spread out, would be preferable.
Sure.
She licked her lips as if she wanted to tell me something, then nodded and walked away. I headed up to her room, the elevators making time slow down and even elongate, as there was information awaiting me. As soon as I entered the room, I grabbed the tablet and reversed to meet Nick in the bar. The tablet contained the information I wanted to review. As I knew myself well enough, I didn't even look at it there. Instead, I tucked the tablet under my arm. If I gave into the urge to review the information now, I would lose all track of time. Nick had grabbed the same booth we'd utilized previously, tucked into the back, yet with views of the main area, and beings were required to walk past us if they needed to use the restroom. I slid in and smiled. She looked so damn good. She dropped her glamour and her tusks jutted out. I gave myself a mental slap. The last thing she needed was me drooling over her, not to mention this wasn't the time or place. Did you inform Moxie we are here? I grabbed the menu as my stomach growled. I needed sugar and protein. Though I hadn't used any magic since the showdown, I was still recovering from the overexpenditure. The puddle drained me hard, and I'd need to retain that information for when we used it next.
Yes, she said 10 minutes.
Her menu was laying in front of her. Wonderful. After she brings us the files, I think the evidence we need is there to give us a starting place. Nick's eyebrows rose, but before she could say anything, a waiter came over to get our orders. She requested water, a double hamburger, fries, and a side salad. I ordered Pepsi, carbonara pasta, and a fruit salad.
I noticed something as we were walking back.
Her voice pulled me away from the tablet as I pulled up the file I needed. Oh? I glanced up at her, noting the crease between her brows.
I think there's a drone following us. I didn't notice it before, but most of the time, I'm not looking up that high. If so, it'd explain how we were found at the house.
My mind took the information and flipped it around in a whirl of options and possibilities. I pulled out my phone and texted Kyoto. You said you were still working on the IP. Any way to see if there are drones on the same network once you discover it? I set the phone down, as I knew staring at it wouldn't get a response any sooner. That actually plays into my thoughts. I believe that the blue light we saw in the Shadows app at Casey and Lark's place was magic controlling the perpetrator. I suspect the same method was utilized on the others. I asked Moxie to look for any deaths that meet the descriptions of the puppets, as little as we have for most of them, as well as anything that seems suspicious.
What would qualify as suspicious?
Nyc leaned forward, her brown eyes locked onto me. I had to fight to not preen. I really was a ridiculous peacock when it came to her. Suicides by people that lack any indicators for suicide. Accidents that happen nearby almost immediately after the murder. If my suppositions are accurate, there should be some for all of the cases, except the first murder. Nyc opened her mouth to ask questions, but the server arrived with food. We moved the plates around, making sure we each had what we needed, but still had ample space to put files. The portions were generous. Majestic had many non-human customers, and many of us required more sustenance than the average mortal. I let my attention graze over the people passing by, or in the general area, but no one matched the vague ideas I had.
And what do you think is going on?
Nyc had taken a bite of her burger, but waited to ask the question prior to taking another bite. The tablet sat there glowing with the information I suspected would exist, but I might be wrong. The autopsy would tell me for sure. While I was trying to decide if I wanted to let her know about my crazy theories, Moxie walked up.
You want a lot.
Her voice was flat as she set a large pile of files down.
These are all copies. I'm not letting originals out. Here's the information on deaths that match your criteria. Do you think you can figure out who's doing this? Right now, anyone who is not on an active case, which is currently only Rat and Janine, Danny and Zypher, and Sin and Gui, has been told to stand down and lock up. Not to leave their houses if they can avoid it and be on high alert. We sent all employees home, and only Maven and I are working.
I leaned in close to peer at her. The lights in the bar were deceiving, but when I looked, I could see the rings under her eyes, and exhaustion carved into her face. Instead of her normal pristine, if antiquated, clothes, her shirt was rumpled. There were stains on her slacks, and her socks were mismatched. Moxie, I'm sorry, but we are... She cut me off with a wave of her hand.
I know. Alder knows. It's only been 2 days. I just hope you can find something in there, because I don't see anything.
Her mouth opened like she was going to say more, but she snapped it shut and spun on her heel, disappearing into the crowd around the bar. Her appearance and words served to dampen what little buoyancy I had managed to channel. I glanced at Nyc and saw she felt the pressure as well. Instead of continuing our chat, we finished our food and pushed the dishes out of the way, though I ordered another Pepsi to focus on the files. I pulled the tablet to me and pulled up the list of agents. I stared at it for a long time, then put it to sleep and focused on the folders. I have this crazy idea. It is so fanciful, I fear you will find it unbelievable. However, these files should either disprove my theory, or they may show there is no reason it could not be true. Most of my colleagues would have rolled their eyes at me. Nyc just nodded. We settled down to go through the files. As I had started to fear, there was no evidence that would point to someone trying to get revenge. Many incidents the agents investigated were either animals, magical, and mundane. The perpetrators were killed, or it was magic just overlapping into the mortal world that caused the issue. There were very few where there would even be family left behind. Though it did expose us to the wide range of agents that worked for Duo. Angels, witches, vampire exorcists, creatures both mundane and unbelievable. Alder had managed to gather employees of all sorts. It was both impressive and intimidating. Why would he think I had any valuable abilities? We sat there for 2 hours, and the only thing anyone had in common was the Yeti case.
You think the agents or mortals that were killed had family that blames Duo?
Nyc looked a bit shell-shocked, and I had to fight to not let the feeling show on my face. When compared to an angel, a half-orc and half-fairy didn't seem all that impressive. Maybe, I offered. I want to see what Moxie discovered regarding bodies found in the general area prior to discussing my supposition. Nyc looked at me for a long time, then shrugged, and we pulled the files over. It would have been nice if it had taken us hours, and we didn't find anything concrete, but the victims weren't that lucky. Near the waterfront, a man who looked very much like the one we'd seen via the Shadows app had drowned in the river. Another man was found dead in a van not a mile from the fountain, with the time of death set at 10 minutes before Emily was found. Another man was killed when he raced from the rest stop, where Burl and Mariah were killed, into the middle of I-5 and was struck by a car. He later died at the hospital. And Moxie had the girl that killed Jeff and Mark identified. She had driven her car off the highway into the ocean in San Francisco. She was dead by the time they pulled her out.
Does this support your thoughts?
Nyc asked as we looked at all the people who had died. I didn't have a doubt they were all victims, not killers. I believe so. I think we have a PuppetMaster. I said the words slowly, expecting her to laugh. Nyc frowned and shook her head.
I don't understand.
Did you ever see any of the movies about Pinocchio? I asked. She shook her head, and I made the mental note to get her to watch one someday. There were some of the non-Disney ones that were excellent and a bit darker than what Disney did. Most magicals understood that fairy tales were warnings, not entertainment. Marionettes are controlled by strings. You tug and they can dance, hug, bow, really almost any movement the joints allow. The PuppetMaster is pulling the strings. I think these people were used as puppets. I tapped the faces of the victims as I talked. They're simply the tools for this PuppetMaster to kill others with, and it makes this killer a mass murderer, as from my count, the death toll is up to 17 people, if you include the 4 that attacked us. Nyc sat back, slowly blowing out air between her lips.
That is a lot of people.
Yes, and it implies a lot of power. She tilted her head.
Do you know who it is?
I think I do, but it seems impossible. After all, they are supposed to be dead. My words felt heavy and thick as they left my lips.
Chapter 23. Nyc. What? I sat back up, peering at him. What do you mean? Stel shifted under my gaze, and I remembered I was in my true form. Glaring at someone with tusks could scare people. I tried to soften my look, and he swallowed even harder.
We agree these people are being used somehow.
I nodded at that.
And all evidence points to an animal or animals being involved with killing Lester and Brian.
I nodded again. He pulled up the tablet and pointed to 2 names.
She was a mesmerist. She could control anyone she could see. When she was with her partner, she could activate latent powers. Their dual powers weren't listed, either because Duo wasn't sure of the nature of their abilities or because that information had been removed.
Why would it be removed? The idea of not having needed information was a bit scary to me. After all, weren't Duo and Alder supposed to be our support? If they didn't have it, it made being an agent that much riskier.
Nobody who knows about our third set of powers controls access to important information. Honestly, part of me is astonished that Moxie would keep this information available online. But they were also some of the first agents Alder had. I'm wondering if it is possible that they didn't say what their third-tier ability was.
Stel spoke the words slowly, as if fighting through his thoughts. Okay, but how does that connect to now? I was a bit lost. Jane was dead, and mesmerists couldn't control people like that. They gave mental commands or suggestions. This was puppetry, like Stel had mentioned. Stel tapped the tablet again.
Look at Victor. His magic was being a bear shifter, but when he was with her, he could talk to and control animals. What if together they could control anyone, even remotely? Be inside them, like they were the vehicle they were driving.
Like the one who spoke to us. It was Victor's voice? I said, remembering the words.
That is my supposition.
Stel nodded, his face a mask as if scared of my thoughts. I stared at him, Then the pictures of the dead mortals who had been used as tools in the battle. That would mean that Victor and Jane are alive. Alder said they were dead.
No, he said they found bodies that they guessed were theirs. 2 women and a man. What if those were just people that died in the avalanche?
Stel froze, and a grin splashed across his face.
Would you be a dear and read me the details regarding the avalanche?
The pit of my stomach churned with the longing at the deer. I pushed it down and pulled up the file with the case. Stephen's Passkey area, I said. It took me a bit longer to find the dates, but finally I read them off as Stel's fingers flew over the tablet.
Aha! That is what I thought. When it happened, 8 people were thought missing, but 5 were found alive. The other 3 were identified from remains when the snows melted, 2 years later.
I blinked, feeling slow and stupid compared to his thoughts. Right? That is what Alder said. Stel winked.
Do you really think Alder or Duo would list any of their agents as the ones missing? Especially when tracking down a Yeti?
It dawned on me. Of course not. They never mentioned the authorities that they had people missing.
Which means Alder had assumed, or someone made sure he thought, they were his missing agents.
Stel muttered something I couldn't catch and slammed the files closed.
And he won't tell us because for him it is a shameful story in his past, and the last thing he wants to do is think about it.
Even if you tell him they might be alive? That made no sense to me. Avoiding the truth rarely brought any joy.
Alder's powerful, sure of himself, and detests showing any sign of weakness. Trust me, my father is just like him. Everything I'm not.
He didn't meet my eyes, just staring at the table. I don't understand. I tried to be gentle, but that rarely worked for me. The question came out more exasperated than I wanted. He flashed a smile up at me, but it was the shadow of a true one.
My dad is a she-lord, an elf. Tall, gorgeous, smooth, smart, elegant. He never admitted to making mistakes, showing emotions, caring about his son, because all of those would have been seen as weaknesses in the she-courts. So he never dared. Alder isn't as casually cruel as Dad was, but he doesn't like to have his errors thrown in his face.
Stel sighed and waved his hand like dismissing a fly.
We need to talk to Rat or Jeannie, and I need to think. Meet you back in the room? Rooms.
He looked at me, almost seeking permission. Sure. I was confused, but that wasn't new.
My gratitude knows no bounds, milady.
He bowed his head, then slipped out of the booth, and was gone before I could come up with anything else to say. I stared at the files laying there and slowly gathered them up. I'd have to return them because I didn't really like the idea of leaving them in our rooms. Besides, maybe talking to Maven instead of Moxie wasn't a bad idea. I pulled out my phone and texted Maven. It's Nyc. You free to talk to me in the Majestic? I'm in the bar. Her response popped up. Deities above. Yes, I need a drink. I'll be there in 10. I flipped through the files again, reading over things that they had done. All of them were so talented and had so many skills. I could kill quickly and efficiently, but even with that, I was a risk to others. I ended up on the Yeti case again. Stel was right. It was the only one that had any sets of the agents who had been killed and involved Cold. In most of the other files, there was nothing about Cold. But until Stel pointed it out, I would have never seen it. Movement out of the corner of my eye had me lifting my head as Maven slipped in, holding a bottle of rum. Why me and not Moxie? Moxie has made up her mind. I want your views. My words were blunt. Stel could do the pretty words, not me. Maven looked at me for a long moment, then took a swig of the bottle. I knew Mariah. She was a friend. And Jeff. He was the sweetest guy. Would bring me cookies. Why haven't you guys caught them yet? She fought back a sob. Because we have no clues, and it has barely been 2 days. I didn't mention we were also exhausted at this point, and already needed to sleep, but that was still hours away. She blinked at me. Oh, it seemed longer. She took another swig. You have to understand, We've lost agents before. The jobs you're sent on are dangerous, but there is a difference between someone being killed on a job and being hunted down. We all feel like we're being hunted." For a minute, Maven looked so young I wanted to reach over and hug her, even though she had to be at least 10 years older than me. I guess growing up as an unwanted bastard child gave me odd views about family. It also made you grow up fast. I get that. I wanted to ask if you remembered the Yeti case where Jane and Victor were killed. Maven took a smaller swig this time, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, it was a few years ago. I know Lester had a shouting match with Alder and quit over it." "Do you know exactly why he quit?" I probed. Alder and Moxie had mentioned the fight, but not all the details. "For sure? No. But Brian came by a few days later to get final checks and pick up some paperwork. We went out for coffee. He said he didn't really want to quit, but Lester refused to work for or with Alder again." I didn't need to prompt her to continue. She rolled the rum bottle and kept talking. "When I asked what that meant, Brian wouldn't look at me. He just said, and I quote, 'Alder cares a lot, but sometimes his priorities and those of his agents don't match.' This time, he prioritized the case over making sure we were okay. Then he left. I never saw them again." "Does Alder put us at risk?" The idea made me vaguely nauseous, and I couldn't explain why. "Sure. Every incident he sends you out on, you're at risk. He knows you might die, but that's why he'll get you anything you need to do the job. I think when Jane was killed, he just locked everything down, wanted to stop the Yeti before it set off another avalanche. Retrieving the dead doesn't help the living." I watched her as she wouldn't look at me. Did he not like Jane? There's lots of people I didn't like, but I felt like something was missing. Maven's head jerked up. "No, of course he did. We all liked her. She was sweet and just always there for people." She gave me a funny half shrug. "She was missed." But Victor wasn't. Maven sighed, taking a drink. The bottle had been half full when she came in, and now it was almost empty. But she didn't act like she'd been drinking. Either it wasn't rum, she hadn't had any before she sat down, or she had a very high alcohol tolerance, or a mixture of all three. "Victor was very Russian," she said softly. "Which means what?" I had no clue what that phrase meant. "He was loud, confrontational, and challenged everything. When the mission was done and vodka was flowing, he was everyone's best friend. While on the mission, he followed the plan and pulled more than his weight, though he didn't hesitate to speak up or challenge anything that didn't seem right." She fell silent, the ambient noise of the bar almost overwhelming. "But before?" I finally asked when it was that, or let her sit there like a weepy drunk, and I was really sure she wasn't drunk or weepy. Maven ran her fingers across the table, drawing random lines in the water left from drinks. "Before," she sighed and pushed the bottle away. "I knew I should have mixed the rum with Red Bull. Monster just doesn't work with rum. Vodka's better." I didn't say anything, but my eyes didn't leave her. "Before, he would challenge everyone, especially Alder, on everything, on the information, the job, why it was needed, how it needed to be handled, and why we had to keep everything secret. In the end, it would go the way you expected, but it was never easy with Victor. It was always a fight, and he remembered everything, never forgot a slight or a favor. He was a hard man to like." She glanced up at me, a smile twisting her lips. "But he loved Jane. He thought she hung the moon. I don't know if she ever figured out that he would destroy the world for her." I froze at those words, trying to envision caring about anyone that much. "But it doesn't matter. They're both dead. Have been for a while." Her sharp, dark eyes glanced up at me. "Why do you ask?" I lied to her with a straight face, just trying to figure out the people Dua has lost. Chapter 24. Stel. I shut the hotel door room behind me and stared at the room without noticing anything. My mind focused on what might have happened, but the pieces still didn't quite fit. With a sigh, I glanced at the connecting door and then pulled my mind away. I needed to focus, and mooning over Nyc was counterproductive in all ways.
Knowing I processed information most efficiently when my hands were occupied, I picked up the animatron and pulled it apart, my mind cataloging the various parts and connections. While my hands unscrewed, twisted, disassembling every part of the little thing, my mind chased shadow thoughts. I almost had the inner workings of the prototype mapped out. Now I'd create one and verify it worked as expected. Once I accomplished creating the first one, the remainder would be simple. My memory wasn't eidetic, exactly. Over the years, given the career I had pursued, my mind was a database with extremely explicit memories. I couldn't tell you what I had eaten 2 days ago or a random item I created, but for everything that was a true replication, I could still retrieve that memory and transfigure something into a replica. Gathering the materials, I started to transfigure them into the animatron. The movie was supposed to be a live-action space opera, but it needed a big battle for the climax, and most of the action was centered around mech suits. This was a model of the mech suits. They would all be painted in unique markings and had some flares that made them unique, but that was easy for the set departments to add after I had the working models. Laying out the base plastics, I put the wires on top, then the surface materials around it. While I could create anything from my bag of elements or even from random material, doing so required much more effort. The wires that were involved, even the circuits, were easily available. It was the manufacturing of them that was cost prohibitive for most companies. Hence, it made sense to use things I only needed to rearrange, not completely create. A chocolate bar was placed next to the mound of materials already broken into pieces for me to eat as I went. Taking a centering breath, I started to create the mechs. It took a little time as it was extremely detailed work, but my magic already knew what I needed to create and how. And it didn't take that much focus at this stage in the process. All the concentration had been learning how to structure it. Now I just needed to direct my magic. It was much like driving. Like driving, it took up one part of my mind and allowed the other to roam and twist the information we had. I was making huge leaps that might be wrong, but there was nothing to disprove my thoughts. Victor Pitorson and Jane Doe were alive. From the files, their powers fit the evidence, and I could not come up with any concrete information to disprove my theory, regardless of what Alder said or even believed. No matter how I twisted in my mind, it still came back to them. But what I couldn't isolate was why would either of them, much less both, be killing people in this manner? "Stel?" Nyc called out from her room. "You are free to come over." I stared at the animatronic, then ran the first test to see if it would charge. I plugged it in, and the little light on the USB-C port flipped to amber. Step 1 was positive. She walked in, a slight frown on her face. "Maven told me more about Victor. Unless I'm wrong, there was nothing in his actions that would make me think he's a killer." "Tell me?" I asked as I put another piece of chocolate in my mouth, while the app on my phone sought my creation via Bluetooth. Nyc settled down on the couch and relayed the conversation with Maven. Nothing popped out to me as information that altered my perceptions as I found the mech model and connected to it. Then a comment grabbed my attention. "Repeat that?" I asked, my head jerking up. "What? That Victor was totally in love with Jane?" she asked, looking at me curiously. Yes, that part. Every part of my mind was focused on this now, the mech still charging. "She just said that Victor thought she hung the stars and would do anything for her. Why?" Nyc looked at me, either curious or confused. I ate another piece of chocolate, providing me with a delay to add this piece to my puzzle. "Nyc, do you read romances? They are a favorite of mine," I offered, not wanting to offend her. "Especially the Regency ones. It reminds me more than I might want of the she courts, but with all their rules and false decorum." She rubbed her face a bit, not looking at me. "Yeah, I like the sweet ones. No sex or anything, just them being tender." She shrugged. "I just like that. Well, that and sci-fi novels," she said in a rush, obviously wanting to deflect. "But why?" I wanted to hug her so badly. The idea of her reading sweet romances just confirmed what I believed, that she was a soft romantic at heart. No one ever had any issue believing I was an incurable romantic, though most would be surprised to learn I also loved horror and hard sci-fi. But her, it made me want to smile the dopiest grin in the world. Instead, I cleared my throat. In romance novels, the hero will do anything to rescue the girl, but he'd never put other people at risk. A true hero will sacrifice his life and even the heroines to rescue a child, find the cure, stop the invasion. Whatever. She nodded. Sure, the needs of the many are outweighed by the needs of one. This time I made no attempt to hide my delight. You love the movies? They're awesome. Of course I do. Her smile matched mine, and it was everything I could do not to rise up and kiss her nose. I cleared my throat again, trying not to act like I was 5. Right. I think this is the opposite of that. What? I mean, we know if Victor is the one doing this, he's the bad guy, right? She looked so hopeful, and I fought down the inappropriate smile. To us, I think he'll burn down the world for Jane, and that is what he's doing, being our guardian. What I don't know is why. I looked away from her, down to the model that had just finished charging, or the power indicator had changed to green at least. I'm lost. I thought it was revenge. That is the part that doesn't make sense. I set the mech down and pulled up the app that went with them. Since each one was identical, it just assigned another name if more than 2 were found on the network, basically creating Mac identification masks. If you wanted to be pissed and just quit, that makes perfect sense. We have reason to believe Jane is alive. Victor also. So why, years later, come back for revenge? I hit the button on the app and my heart sank as nothing happened. But then the lights on the shoulders of the mech popped on, and the command query opened up on the app. Ha! I think I did it! Nyc's attention shifted to my little model. Oh? Yep, look. I hit the walk command, and after that 2-second delay, it started to walk forward in a straight line. My giggle of delight made her smile, so we were totally derailed for a bit as I went through all the commands. They were pretty basic. Walk, stop, lights on, lights off. Raise left arm, raise right arm. All of them went perfectly. The only thing that wasn't working was punch. I picked up the prototype and went over the circuits again in my brain as I compared that to what was in front of me, while Nyc played with my version of the model. There it is. Give it to me. I held my hand out and she placed it in my outstretched hand, hers almost twice the size of mine. I focused and twisted the wiring just a bit inside the arm until it matched the disassembled model. Let's try again. I set it down and commanded walk and punch. Both went perfectly. Got it. This will make Kimberly happy. I grinned up at her. As long as I am back in a week, I'll have plenty of time to create these. But I can start now if I swing by a hobby store and get supplies. Nyc nodded, her eyes distant. Stel, what if we're wrong? Wrong about what? I had to bring my mind back to the correct conversation. My giddy high from succeeding in making the models to work had distracted me. About them surviving. That threw me. What do you mean? I'm pretty sure they can't do this PuppetMaster stuff without both of them, and all the people Moxie found all had magical beings somewhere in their past or relatives that had the ability to use magic. Everything fits into place. Victor killed Lester and Brian in his bare form. The others, he pulled their strings as if they were marionettes. Their magic made it easy to kill the other agents. Her face creased into a frown that did not fit her at all. Nyc should always smile. My emotions ran the gamut, so I grabbed the model and started putting it back together as I waited for her to elaborate on her conclusions. Chapter 25. Nyc. So, this is just a feeling, but what if... I trailed off, trying to put into words the random thought that had popped into my mind, but it wouldn't become a real thought. Just a feeling. I started again. When I was in the orphanage, one of the helpers, we called them floor mothers, got hit by a drunk driver. His eyes darkened in sympathy, but I kept going. She was hurt pretty bad, but survived. When she came back,
Her leg didn't work right anymore. Even with the priests using healing spells and the doctors working on it, they couldn't repair all the damage that was caused, which means she probably needed to walk with a cane and could easily be pushed off balance. I sighed, scratching my forehead. Which more than one kid used to distract her. They'd bump into her, make her fall, and while they were helping her get up, someone else would do something they shouldn't have been doing. I brushed that part away. I suppose it didn't really matter. What I'm saying is, she was mad, resentful, and became bitter. She used to be nice, always had a smile for all of us. After that, she became bitter and always angry at everything because she had been hurt and the driver only lost his license for a year. Well, she would have this for the rest of her life. That twisted her until she lost her job. She grew to hate us because we could run and jump, and she couldn't any longer. I growled in frustration, still unable to get it to pop into clarity. Here, enjoy some chocolate. It assists my ability to process information. Stel handed me a square of dark chocolate, and I slipped it into my mouth. The rich chocolate flooded my mouth with creamy cinnamon. It soothed my soul as I let it melt on my tongue. He continued to put the prototype together while he gave me time to think. It was one of the things I really liked about him. He never rushed me or even tried to finish my sentences. Instead, he gave me time to find the words to express my thoughts. It was rare in my world. Everyone assumed I was stupid, and maybe I was, but he never made me feel that way. What if one or both of them were hurt by the snow or the Yeti? Or when Victor found her, they didn't find her right? Stel shook his head, his green eyes paying attention to me, even as his hands moved to put the model back together. What if she was hurt, and even though she is healing, she isn't fully better, like the floor mom? She got physically better, but the emotions twisted her. What if one of them didn't get better, or got twisted, or maybe recently died from it? I was talking out loud, and it still didn't sound quite right. Stel paused, his head tilted slightly as if listening to whispering in his mind. I think you've isolated the issue. What if they were grievously injured? I don't believe either of them are dead, but it is possible they were impaired and are either finally stable or... He trailed off and grabbed the tablet. Yes, I think you've nailed the situation, Nyc. Here are the keywords and the messages that were left. Stel tapped the tablet as he spoke. Die cold and alone. Shatter. Frozen. Buried. Frozen with fear. Frostbite kills bit by bit. Feel the frost. He looked up at me, his face shining. Jane was buried by the avalanche, and we have reason to believe she wasn't found for 3 days. She could have survived that long, especially if she could melt snow to drink and was properly attired. But frostbite slips in and breaks you apart bit by bit. Maybe her, maybe both of them. But yes, I believe this is why their personalities would have altered and the attack started. You are a genius! I felt my face heat. Nope, just trying to figure this out. But let's say we're right. Everything is accurate. I shrugged. Now what? Stel sagged back a bit, looking at the model he had almost completely put back together. I am unsure. We both sat there staring at the models. Stel spoke, startling me after a few minutes of silence. At this point, I can only think of a single activity to occupy our time while we await word from Kyoto. I glanced over at him, eyes wide. He looked back at me, and he turned the cutest shade of pink I'd ever seen and coughed. That is not what I was suggesting. I mean, I was going to search the net to see if perhaps Victor was unwise enough to utilize his name or a version of it on any public sites. I would never, that isn't... He stammered and babbled. Mixed emotions washed through me, unsure if I was relieved or disappointed. Either way, it didn't matter. We do need to sleep, however. I glanced at the clock, and we were supposed to go back to Lester and Brian's place, but it is after 6, which means it will be dark soon. Light is important for this activity. Oh, yes, of course.
I'm still a tad hyper, both from the success of the model and the sugar. But a solid slumber would not be amiss. However, I do believe I will take the time to run a few searches and see if anything comes up.
He looked everywhere but at my face, and I managed to keep any emotions from slipping through. Yes, being tired would be stupid. I rose to my full height, feeling like I was an ugly giant while he sat there. Though, when we get back, I need some new tattoos to replace my cinque. I glanced at the blank spaces on my arms. We'd found out the hard way if the weapons weren't replaced after an hour or so of materializing, they tended to fade away. It did make getting rid of weapons I didn't want on my skin any easier, but right now, it meant I was short weapons, which made me uncomfortable.
True.
We both looked at each other, unsure how to continue or what to do. I did think of one thing. I managed as I tried to think of a graceful way to exit the discussion and the room. He perked up, the pink fading from his cheeks to my disappointment. Yeah, if one of them was hurt, maybe like a coma or something, do you know if the other person's powers would still work? I knew I could ask Alder, or probably Moxie or Maven, but I didn't. Maybe it just felt too hard right now.
That is a wonderful question.
He pulled up the tablet and typed.
I'm tapping into the Duo site and the internal support system for agents.
He had to do multiple security checks to get through, including scanning his eye with his camera before he finished logging in.
I do not see that it has ever been addressed, though we are noted in here as one of the few that only have a single coin. Very curious. I would have thought it was more usual, but apparently most agents control their powers separately as opposed to singularly, as we do.
That did surprise me, but then I hadn't had much interaction with very many agents. So, they don't know. He shrugged.
If they do, there's no document relating to that possibility, but I believe it would be a wise thing to test for multiple reasons.
I figured if one of them was in a coma. I trailed off, not sure where he was going with this.
Correct, but the thought occurs to me, what if one of us was knocked out? Would the other person's powers shut off or still be usable?
Stel's eyes were bright at this new idea. My stomach dropped and my throat clamped tight as that idea worked through my head. It took me 2 tries to say what I wanted to say. That would be very bad if you were knocked out. He paled this time.
Oh, yeah, that might be a bad thing.
The scenario was clear in my mind. Stel unconscious on the ground, me going berserker and killing anything that came near me until I forced the idea away before it could become real. Thinking that way was bad. But we should know, just in case. I offered, feeling a bit sick to my stomach. Stel nodded.
You're both tired. You only had 2 or 3 hour nap. I've been up for a while. Why don't you go crash and I'll test it when you're asleep? I want to finish my tests and see if I can order some supplies. Then I'll crash and tomorrow we can go over to Lester's place and then see if we can figure out where to go from there.
Okay. Night. I rose and headed to the room. The bed sounded good. I stripped down to underwear and a tank top, then crawled in bed. The last thing that registered was Stel muttering to himself as he worked on the prototype. Chapter 26. Stel.
All of my senses were attuned to the sounds Nyc made in the next room. The door was barely ajar, and every rustle of her clothing or the sheets grabbed my attention. Frustrated, I put the models away, wrapping them carefully up. The odds were I'd have time to create more, but to make my life easier, I needed supplies. I ordered online and had it shipped to one of the public drop-offs for the Majestic. There were days when I thought I might want to live here. Then I remembered what the room cost per night. 3 days was more than my monthly rent. My thoughts couldn't leave the mystery of the dead agents. If Victor was behind all of this, and the reality was I could be so far off base that you'd need a telescope to connect the parts, why kill these 2? There was something we were missing, and those parts were driving me crazy. A soft snore from the other room pulled my attention back, and I realized I'd managed to waste an hour ordering supplies and musing over things. Quietly, I rose and moved over to the connecting door and gently pushed it open. The Majestic took care of their rooms, and it was silent as it swung open. Nyc lay there, her green skin looking out of place against the stark white sheets. It frizzed through my head, trying to figure it out. Then it hit me. You didn't often see green against snow. I would need to compare her to daffodils coming up through the snow instead. My fingers sought the comfort of the coin in my vest, but I didn't flip it. Instead, I checked my magic first. I held out my right hand and called for a butterscotch candy. I knew that one inside and out. Sugar, butter, heavy cream, and heat. It was easy to make. I popped it in my mouth and grinned. Too bad it took so much energy to make. My butterscotches were incredible. The sugar only partially compensated for what I'd spent. It proved the point. The next thing was to see if my magic would work for sound while she was asleep. I pulled out the coin, looking at it with a smile. 2 coins made 1. It had changed my entire life, and I couldn't be happier. I inhaled and flipped the coin. The subtle shift of magic washed over me, and I started to whistle to see if I could use my sound-to-light trick. Before I could inhale enough to start to whistle, Nyc bolted straight up from the bed, her blanket falling at her feet. From what I could tell, she'd basically levitated to stand on the bed. Her Zweihander in her hand, so fast I barely saw her pull it from her arm. She pulled the sword up to her right, her eyes alighting on me, and I saw her muscles tense to leap. My fingers were frozen in terror and awe, but before she got to the end of the bed, I flipped the coin back over. Both of her feet hit the floor, and she stopped swaying a bit. Nyc, I managed to get out, stunned at how she'd reacted. The sword slowly lowered, and she blinked multiple times, looking at me. Stel, that was the test. I forced the lump in my throat down and ordered my pounding heart to mellow out. Yes, I take it that worked. Whoa. She put the sword back on her arm and sank onto the foot of the bed. That was intense. It didn't occur to me you would react like that. Are you okay? I wanted to hover and make sure she was fine because she had a gray pallor to her skin I'd never seen before. She started to rise, but her knees shook and she sank back down. Could you grab me a water? Of course. The words were not even out of my mouth before I had the mini fridge open and was grabbing 2 water bottles. I handed her one, my guilt causing my throat to ache with tightness. Thanks, she murmured as she downed the bottle in one go. Wow. What happened? I resisted the urge to hug her, my worry pushing almost everything else out of my mind. Her eyes were closed and she breathed in and out deeply. Then she opened her eyes to look at me. You know those movies where they shove a needle into someone's heart and inject stuff into it to kickstart them or something? Needle of epinephrine in the heart, yes. There were multiple movies and hospital dramas where that was staple. That. It was like it slammed into me and I went from at peace, I guess, to full berserker. It hurt. Normally it doesn't hurt, I questioned. No, it feels like a wave washing into me. I'm ready for it. I embrace it. This was a tidal wave grabbing me and pulling me under. I didn't like it. Her voice shook just the smallest amount and I thought I might be sick. I can't apologize enough, I stammered out, my tongue thick with horror. I had done this to Nyc. I was supposed to help protect her, her partner. Nyc waved her hand at me. We needed to know. On the bright side, I'm pretty sure that would pull me out of coma. She rubbed her chest, then held out her hand for another bottle. I hastily handed it to her. Maybe, but I'm not sure that was a wise way to do it. I shouldn't have put you at such a risk. My own guilt beat at me. Stel, stop it. Nyc caught me in her gaze. This was needed. No guilt. We should mention it to Alder at some point, but I don't think most agents are like me. I'm a brute. Nothing else. The rest? She shrugged. I'll be fine. I rubbed my forehead but gave in to her logic. You are correct. I will let Alder know. Is there anything else I can do for you?
I'm headed to bed. That wake-up wiped me out more than our battle did. I'm fine.
She rose and stretched, the camisole riding up to expose abs of green steel.
You need sleep too.
With that, she crawled back into bed, punched the pillow twice, and closed her eyes.
Night, Stel.
I stepped back, closing the door, though leaving it open a crack. The test had been important, though that didn't change my guilt. Needing to distract myself, I grabbed the tablet as I changed for bed. In the huge bed that could have fit at least 5 of me, I slipped under the covers and leaned against the headboard as I searched the internet. Social media was a bust. Victor didn't have anything under his name, and looking for Jane Doe was a waste of time. I couldn't find anything that might have linked back to them. And while the Yeti incident had only been a few years ago, it was long enough that most of the information were a few news articles, not the swarm of social media there would be now. With a sigh, I set the tablet aside and flipped off the light. We were missing something. I could feel it, but I had no idea what it was or how to access it. My last thought as I fell asleep was a worry that I wouldn't be able to protect her if everything fell apart.
Chapter 27. Nyc. Even though I hadn't been asleep long, that rush sapped the energy I had. Rather than waking up at my normal time of 6 a.m., I slept until past 8. The clock told me I'd slept for over 12 hours, which I didn't do often, but I felt refreshed and whole. The shower sounds in the next room let me know Stel was up and moving, which meant I needed to be as well. 15 minutes later, my dirty clothes stacked to one side, I knocked on the door, dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and my jacket. My boots waited to be pulled on, but until we were leaving, there wasn't any reason to add an extra inch to my height.
Come in, Nyc. I've got breakfast on the way up.
I pushed the door open before he finished talking, and smiled as I saw him neatening up the room.
Did you sleep well?
He asked, though for a minute it sounded like there'd been another word he hadn't said. Very. I don't recommend that wake up to 3rd level magic. It is a knockout punch.
I do apologize again. If I had thought this through, I would never have suggested something with such bad side effects.
I waved my hand at him. It was something we needed to know, and now we do. What is our plan for today? I knew we needed to go to the former agent's house, but other than that, I had 0 clue. He smiled at me.
Correct you are. However,
he paused to draw out the temptation. I just smiled and waited, leaning up against the wall. He was so noble and elegant. I had the feeling that he would have been an excellent stage actor.
Kyoto contacted me. I, like all upstanding and virtuous people, was sound asleep when he sent the messages at 2:30 this morning.
I felt myself perk up. He wouldn't be so happy if it was nothing.
Kyoto found a trace, backtracked it to a location, and verified that there are multiple drones and spiders interacting with that network.
I blinked. Spiders? I couldn't help but look in the corner of the room as if there might be an 8-legged creature staring at us, ready to pounce. I didn't mind them too much. Even black widows couldn't get through my tough skin, but the idea just seemed creepy.
Not arachnoids. Spiders are bots that crawl the internet looking for information. All of these spiders are focused on Duo, which, even though Duo keeps a low profile, not all agents do.
Wait, what? My mind just kept coming up with images that made 0 sense. They were talking about cases on Facebook and stuff. Stel raised his hands up, shaking his head.
No, nothing like that, but they'll post vacations and plans. In fact, I think that is how Jeff and Mark were killed. Or at least, it made it easier.
He moved over and picked up the tablet, tapping on something and turning it toward me. I took it, peering at the screen. On it was a post from Jeffrey talking about how they were going to spend the evening in and have some of the best Thai in the city while they watched a new movie. It wasn't anything fancy. The normal social media post you put a heart on and moved on. Oh, there wasn't much more to say.
Right. If we are right, Victor already knows names and rough places. If he is using social media to track them, explains why they were killed.
He took the tablet back and pulled up 2 more screens. When I looked at them, I could see Emily mentioning holiday plans in Portland to see family, and Burl and Mariah talking about stopping to see the falls and driving down I-5. There's nothing to indicate they were agents or anything more than the most casual conversation. Yet in hindsight, it was obvious. Does Alder know this?
This part? No, but I did let him know about Victor and Jane. I think it took him by surprise.
I couldn't help it. That surprised me. But what if we are wrong? What if I was wrong? Stel shrugged.
Then we are wrong. I mean, if they are dead, it does not affect anything. But if they aren't, then it could change everything.
I nodded. You said Kyoto tracked them down? To where?
For that we will require jackets, packs, and, well, I'm not sure.
He pulled up a map on the tablet.
Per his information, it all goes back to the Bagby hot springs up in the mountains.
I took it and looked at the satellite view. Does he know which house? Are there houses? It looked like rather wild terrain, and the nearest actual city was more than 20 minutes away by car.
No, just the area. He said it was bounced, but not professional level. Good enough to beat most people, but not a real hacker-level attempt.
He looked pensive.
It could be yet another red herring, and we have no idea who this is. I mean, Duo has angels on its payroll. If it is a demon or an ascending being, we are light years out of our comfort zone.
He looked up at me, his green eyes dark.
We may be wasting time, and even now another death is happening.
We are trying. It is all we can do. Want to try Rat one more time while we eat? I offered, walking to the door to let in the server. She wheeled in a cart with bacon, eggs, oatmeal, fruit, yogurt, and 2 plates of pancakes. There was a large carafe of orange juice and 1 of coffee. I went for the coffee, while Stel poured himself the OJ and then a mug of coffee.
Sure, I'll place the call with the phone on speaker.
Stel said after draining the orange juice. He pulled up the number from the agent's list and dialed. The phone rang twice before being picked up.
Yeah.
Stel cleared his throat.
Is this Rat? This is Stellan El Duvani. I'm an agent with Duo. Huh. Maybe. What you need?
The voice didn't sound like he believed us, but at least he didn't hang up immediately.
Alder has us working on the issue of some agents being killed.
Stel started. Rat cut him off.
You mean being hunted down and slaughtered like animals? You get anywhere?
Stel grabbed a piece of bacon, wrapped it in a pancake, and then began to cover the entire thing in syrup.
Maybe. That is what we wanted to ask you. Do you remember Victor and Jane?
Rat barked out a quiet laugh.
You mean the bear and the sweetheart? Yeah, I remember them. It was a shame losing them like that. I didn't like how it went down. That was what we wanted to ask you. What exactly happened? As far as we can tell, everyone else involved in the Yeti case is dead. You think they are connected to this somehow?
Stel glanced at me as he created another bacon pancake wrap.
I think they are the ones doing it.
His voice was calm, but I couldn't help but look at the phone wishing this person was here so I could see their reactions. There was a long moment of silence.
I thought they died.
There was suspicion in Rat's voice, and I couldn't blame him.
I don't think they did. The bodies found were identified as missing locals, not 2 out-of-towners. Besides, Alder would have never told local authorities that 2 of his agents were missing.
Stel had the slightest note of chiding in his voice.
Ha! That he wouldn't.
There was silence.
I could see that bastard doing something like this. He swore he'd kill us all if a hair on her head was hurt and we could have prevented it. Was ranting and raving even as he tore out IVs and pulled on boots. Granted, he said stuff like that a lot, but would calm down in a few hours. Could you please elaborate?
Stel hit mute and munched on his over-sugared protein concoction. I didn't know if I should be impressed or grossed out. I just worked on the eggs with a bit of pepper.
Victor worshipped the ground that woman walked on. I mean, she was nice, a real sweetheart, but she'd have bored me to tears in an hour. When we pulled him out of the snow, there was no sign of her, and we looked until dark. The dogs couldn't find her either.
There was a strange pause there, and I noticed Stel's eyes narrowed at that.
Well, we got him into the hospital. He had a hell of a lump and was out of it for a full day, and they never found Jane. That was the first question on his lips when he opened his eyes. When we said we couldn't find her, he went crazy. The amount of threats was excessive. I think if we had presented her dead, he might have snapped or broken down.
There was a distant tone to Rhett's voice as he spoke.
Then he tore out of there. I never saw him again. So you think he's still alive?
Stel had eaten quickly and licked his fingers before hitting the unmute button.
You paused when you said you pulled him out and the dogs couldn't find her. Why?
That was the top thing I was wondering about, too. Rat sighed.
So you know his magic, right?
Yes, he's a bear shifter.
Right. Well, when we pulled him out, he was a bear, and there were a few minutes where we're a bit worried he'd pulled out an actual bear and not him. It was him, but he left his essence everywhere. Most bloodhounds are trained to avoid animal scents, and if he had been wrapped around her, his scent would have been stronger than hers by a mile. Which meant the dogs would actively avoid her. But if he transformed back into a bear, assuming he knew how to use his nose, he'd find her in no time.
Stel finished softly, his eyes grave.
Exactly. And trust me, Victor was every inch a bear when he shifted. He could have found her in a few minutes. But he was only okay because of his fur. Lots of other people got frostbite just trying to find them. The weather sucked and it was colder than Jeannie's fur.
Rat sighed.
If it is him, he'll hold the grudge forever. Even apologies never worked. I'll let Jeannie know, but I don't know what else I could tell you. It's been years since I even thought about that case.
Thanks. I think that is the confirmation we were seeking. But you never heard from him after he left the hospital? Stel sat, holding his neck's wrap in his hands, but not moving. I'd moved on to the oatmeal and fruit.
No, which, now that I think about it, surprised me. But you lose people on this job, and the weather still sucked, and the Yeti was still loose.
He sighed.
I'd make different decisions now, but back then it seemed like the right thing to do.
And now? I asked, curious to hear what had changed.
Now I'd have called in extra agents and scoured that area until we found her. Dark, weather, or monsters be damned. If we put the possible fates of others against those that are supposed to have our back, why would they have our back?
His words rang true, and I nodded to myself.
Who was that?
He asked, and I blinked, then remembered he couldn't see us. Sorry, I'm Nyc, Stel's partner.
Good. Watch his ass. I don't know where I'd be if Jeannie ever decided to turn her back on me. Let me know if anything changes. And for what it's worth, tell Victor I'm sorry.
He hung up with that, and Stel and I just looked at each other. Chapter 28. Stel.
I both wanted to bounce in excitement and sing a song for the wronged at the same time. When this was all over, even if we were on a rabid goose chase, I still might sing a ballad for Victor and Jane.
That tells us a lot, but it's still no sure evidence, Nyc pointed out.
You are correct, but at this point I think I would be surprised if it was someone else. After all, most people are killed by someone they know. Why should agents be any different? I smiled and finished off my food. But first, I want to go through Lester and Brian's house, just in case. But we need to pack for Bagby, assuming we're going to have to hike in and camp overnight. My smile brightened. Maybe this time I'll get to see the stars at night. Nyc's laugh was contagious. Soon enough, we were out on Dinos and headed for the house. As a courtesy, I let Detective Joseph know we were headed there, just in case someone reported our presence. Reaching the house, the crime scene tape was everywhere, but rather than entering via the front, we went around again. The back door still wasn't locked, So we cut the tape and slipped in. The old smells of death and decay were still there, but not as overpowering as they had been. Nothing had been obviously touched in the kitchen, and I wasn't about to open the refrigerator to verify if there were new life forms growing. Instead, we moved toward where the bodies had been. While the scene had not been cleaned, the residue was surprisingly little for 2 bodies. Black dust shimmered from every surface. The fingerprint dust, I assume. Looking now, when the bodies were not the focus of our attention, Nyc had been accurate. Nothing was in disarray. In fact, from what I could remember of the scene, it appeared more scattered now. Law enforcement, more likely.
There isn't much here.
Nyc was turning slowly, but she didn't seem tense. No, but I wanted to check their office. She gave me a soft shrug, and we moved around the stain on the floor and headed to the other room I'd glimpsed from the entryway. A desk, bookcase, and keyboard sat there. The black dust glimmered here also, and there was a computer missing.
They took it?
I would assume, I said. They figure most things would be tracked on the computer, but I doubt these 2 did that. I went over to the paper files but found nothing outside of what I would have expected of a house. Then I started looking at the bookcase. A mix of fiction, research, classics, some photo albums, and a stack of letters. That got my attention. I picked them up and started to flip through them as Nyc walked through the room, peering at everything. The first few were cards, some Christmas, birthday, or just hello cards, all kept neatly in their envelopes. But near the bottom, with a postmark date of almost a year ago, I found 3 cards, all addressed to Victor, and each was stamped with "Return to Sender." It was a stamp, not a scribbled note, and every address was different. It looked like Brian, from the return address, had believed Victor was alive. There was one address in Portland, another in Eugene, and the final one was in Snoqualmie, all marked "Return to Sender." I headed over to the desk and slit them open with the letter opener.
What did you find?
Nyc asked, coming to peer over my shoulder. I made sure the envelope was easy to read. It was a blank card with a short note. Victor, contact us. We were wrong. Let us make it up to you. L and B. A phone number was attached to the hand-scribbled note. Each card said much the same thing.
Well, there is no doubt how he knew where to find them, I guess,
Nyc said with a sigh. None at all. Though there had been dishes in the sink, yet most of the house had been pristine. I went back to the kitchen, and there were 3 plates, 3 wine glasses, and 3 sets of flatware there as well. They had been rinsed and were obviously ready to go in the dishwasher. I stood there blinking.
What?
Nyc had followed me. I think a letter reached Victor. I don't think this was a planned kill. I'm wondering if he came over and had dinner and something happened. Something that initiated this domino chain.
So,
Nyc looked at me and I frowned. She elaborated.
Even if this wasn't planned, the rest of it was. Didn't the cops put their deaths about 2 months before Casey and Lark's?
I reviewed the information I had from Joseph. I believe that was the current estimate, that the bodies had been here about 2 months, but they were waiting for final information from the coroner to confirm.
Then this was the start, and whoever it was took those 2 months to plan and set this up. It doesn't matter why it started. None of this is justified, and we have to stop him.
Her words were plain, but they cut right through to the heart of the matter, and I sighed. You are, as always, correct. We have to stop whoever is doing this, which means our next lead is to go to Bagby Hot Springs.
But we need supplies,
she countered, a smile on her face. Yes, supplies are required, I agreed. Luckily, I do not think that will be difficult to do here in Portland. We slipped back out, the letters placed in my vest, and headed into the city proper to do some shopping, and put equipment on the Duo credit card. It was approaching noon by the time we were done. Nyc had kept a watch out for drones, but we hadn't seen any, which did not mean Victor wasn't aware of our movements. But if we could catch him unawares, that would be for the best. Because of that, we decided not to return to the Majestic. If we didn't return in a few days, Alder would be notified. Even if I hated the idea of leaving the models and the prototypes there, it was much safer than dragging them into the mountains with us. We fit the backpacks, bags, tents, and some extra clothes, as well as camping supplies into Dinos' carriers. Then we got on the road and headed to Bagby Hot Springs. Portland in early fall is wet with hints of fire around the edges. The trees were just shading to colors other than the lush green that complemented Nyc's true skin tone. But the olive tone to her human guise looked excellent amid the riot of colors. Riding up the way, I held on to her while going over reaction strategies in my head. I didn't like the idea of killing someone, but given the manner in which this had progressed, I feared there was an infinitesimal possibility of this not ending in death, which meant I needed to decide what I was going to do if we ran into the victor and he attacked. If I had the coin in my hand, I had to flip it, and I had zero idea how his puppet mastery worked.
Do you think Victor will be able to control us?
For a minute, I wondered if my personal voice had started to sound like Nyc's, prior to realizing it was her talking via the intercom system. I was just mulling that over. I am unsure. I've been informed by more than one mystic that my mind is very hard to read or control, but that was from those individuals. It is not an automatic corollary that it will hold for Victor. She gave a soft grunt as she swerved to avoid a driver that decided the rules of physics did not apply to their truck and tried to occupy the same space we were in. A minute later, when we were far clear of the blind man or theoretical physicists, she spoke.
Which means, if he can control me, you are at risk. That means you should send me in before he sees you. If I go insane, kill me and take him out.
What? My hands spasmed tight around her waist. That will not happen. I laced every bit of power and need into that command. And she laughed.
Chapter 29. Nyc. His horror at my statement forced a chuckle. If only he cared about me that much, instead of just an asset for Duo and his partner. Still, I'm flattered you think so highly of me, but I'm disposable. This person can't keep killing, and you'd still have the 3rd level magic, which would give you a few minutes to get to him, to prevent him from doing this again.
Nyc, that is not an option for me. I will not use you as cannon fodder.
His voice snapped at me, hard and brittle. Why not? Alder is. I'm a brute. I know that. This is kind of the definition of a tank. Take all the hits until you take out the bad guy. I thought you played video games. I teased, trying to break the tension that had sprung up.
You are not a tank. You are...
Stel's voice stuttered to a stop, and I chuckled again. I'm a half-orc. Of course I'm a tank. That is pretty much what orcs are. If there is no other option, let me get killed to take him out. It's what I agreed to do. His fingers sank into my waist, but he didn't argue. I sighed and fell back into silence. I was still storing 2 swords, but I almost specifically kept those as bullet deflectors and gutters. I still had multiples, and worst case, I'd activate the brass knuckles and beat him until he was down. A fight between a berserk me and a bear shifter could be fun.
No, it would not. You need armor if you have too many encounters with creatures that have claws.
His voice was still brittle, and I sighed. Me dying just wasn't that big of a deal. That is kind of the cool part. Am I fast enough, smart enough to avoid the claws and still win the fight? It would be something epic. Ooh, maybe if it is recorded, we could put it up on the TV show Magic Fights. The magical community had their own TV station available only to TV with a magical antenna. Magic Fights was a popular show.
Nyc, I'm tempted to beat you, though it would probably accomplish nothing but bruising my knuckles or possibly broken bones. You are unique, irreplaceable, and neither of us is going to die on this case. Personally, I plan on dying in bed, surrounded by 8 grandchildren, 2 of which have been adopted. The idea of that shut my mind down, doing nothing else but following the GPS directions. After another few minutes, I said, "That's super detailed." "Of course. What good is it to have vague goals in life? I know exactly what I desire. It is the achieving it that I am struggling with." He paused this time. "Don't you have any goals?" I thought about that as Dinos labored to pull us up the mountain roads, her purr soothing my sudden anxiety. I had a habit of speaking without thought, and I didn't want to say something that would make it awkward. I guess past getting a good job, not really. I mean, orcs aren't exactly high-powered attorneys and stuff. Having a job that I'm good at and respected at is pretty impressive. I don't know any other orcs working for Duo, so I shrugged, not sure what else to say. Joy had seeped back into his voice. "Then our next project on the way home will be to create a bucket list and milestone list for you. I shall endeavor to ensure you have the ability to pursue all of them, and if I am truly blessed, I will witness your achievements." "What are those?" I had to ask, but I wasn't 1,000% sure. The air had cooled down another 10 degrees, leaving me a bit chillier than I enjoyed, and I was glad I had the thicker jackets and the carriers. "Bucket lists?" He sounded confused. "Yeah, that and the other one." I slowed Dinos more, as the road had become a bit more primitive, and I was all too aware of how much sound the helmets muffled. I didn't want to have another vehicle race around the corner and hit us. Besides, the parking lot for the hot springs was supposed to be right around here. A bucket list is a list of things you want to experience before you die. Skydiving, swimming with sharks, those wide-ranging adventures that you will do once in your lifetime. A milestone is a list of goals that, upon reaching, you want to celebrate. Getting married, getting a promotion, things you plan on doing during your life. Things that you treat them as the next major step in your plans or goals. Oh. The idea had never occurred to me. I'd spent my life trying to be the good kid at an orphanage, as being the bad kid meant you'd never get anywhere. Then trying to make it through the magical society with a minimum of anger. Orcs weren't exactly common, and most magicals took one look at me and assumed I was a dumb brute, which I did use to my benefit sometimes. Mostly I'd just been concentrating on trying to make a life. The stipend that Duo paid me made it so I had a small studio apartment to myself, instead of the pay-by-the-week motels. "The entrance is right here," I said as I slowed way down. We pulled into the lot, and I was surprised at how many cars were there. "Did you say we had to hike to the springs?" "Yes, and it is at least a mile. They must be popular." I tucked Dinos into a corner of the lot where she'd be the least noticeable. Not that I was worried about anyone stealing her. We settled the packs on, made sure we had water and food. I checked Stel over. He had hiking boots, a layering hoodies, gloves, and extra food. We were as prepared as we could get. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked as we headed to the trailhead. "Kyoto just said up here." He paused and looked around. See it?" He pointed at a power pole that went past the parking lot. There, near the top, was a square box. It was painted a dark brown that blended in with everything else unless you looked. "And that is?" I just saw a box and would have never given it a second look. Stel was staring at his phone and smiled. "That is a router. USFS Wi-Fi 10. I'm pretty sure the Forest Service doesn't have Wi-Fi up here. It is WPA secured, so no reading what it is receiving, but it tells me there are probably other routers or the location is here in range. So we hike? Until we find something." He ducked his head as we started up. The air was crisp and smelled of snow. The temperature was dropping, and I was glad we had prepared, though we only had supplies for 2 to 3 days. We moved through the forest, the crunch of the sticks and leaves under our feet the only sound.
Do you have any? I asked as we walked. A squirrel chittered at us and hopped from tree to tree, swearing at us.
Any what?
Stel was walking ahead of me. As if he fell, I had a chance of catching him. He could never do that for me. He glanced back as he spoke, and I enjoyed the flush of excitement that lit up his face. Bucket items, milestones, those things.
Of course. I plan on having kids, as I said. I'd like to see Niagara Falls. All of those are the bucket things. Milestones? Well, getting my first car was one. Then my own place. I still want to be appointed lead fabricator. I want to get married. I want to accomplish numerous items, but all of them will require me to work towards those goals.
He fell silent, and the chittering of the squirrel was the loudest sound until a pair of hikers came down the trail toward us. The noisy thing stopped and went scampering away. We nodded at each other, and they continued down as we did up. This could have been on my bucket list. I might have to create one. Chapter 30. Stel.
I stood looking at the bathing facilities at the hot springs. They had a few communal tubs, and then private baths that you could use. The tubs were big enough that both Nyc and I could have fit in one. I ended that line of thought before I could carry it too far. This was just placed on my bucket list. These look incredible, I said to Nyc as we stood there, taking a break to get some water and use the toilets before we continued.
I'll join you. It does look nice.
We waited until no one was leaving or coming up, then took off farther up. I could still see the Wi-Fi, but the signal strength was dropping. I'd expected the drop to be much more rapid. He must have a very strong router there. Now there was no trail, so we headed up until we were out of range of anyone at the springs being able to see us. Now what? You know that wilderness tracking is not my forte. I marveled at the hawk sitting on a tree branch, watching us until it shook all its feathers and launched into the sky.
I won't swear this is my skill set either, but we only have another 2 hours of light. You would have had to get supplies up here somehow, so I think we should look for smoke or tire tracks.
That works for me, milady. In which direction should we head? I turned, seeing nothing around us. Nyc stood there for a long time, then turned.
North.
North it is, but may I inquire as to that direction? I asked as we pivoted and began to walk in that direction.
It's a guess on my part, really. If you were going to build up here and wanted it unnoticed, you'd probably put it against the mountain, not out in the open. Let's head that way and then track one way or another.
There is more logic than I had available. North we shall head. The air was so clear and sharp it made me wonder how I could tolerate the smoggy air that seemed the norm in LA. Maybe I did need to move. A deer came around a tree and froze, watching us. Her head turned, but she didn't move until we were multiple trees away. Then she sprang away fast, the bushes and trees not even slowing her down. I went back and forth between wanting to fill the air with idle chatter to keep Nyc entertained, and decided to stay silent to enjoy the sounds of the world around us. Periodically, I would pause and see if we were still in range.
Good, you do that. I'm looking for other human tracks walking through here or bear. So far, I've seen neither,
Nyc said as she watched the ground and then around us. We are still in poor range, so I'm thinking we probably need to go toward it a bit.
Okay,
she said simply, and altered our path a bit. I put my trust in her because I was already hopelessly lost, but it did make me pose the question. You do know how to find our way back to the bike, right? Visions of wandering for eons in the forest made me want to rush back to the bike now. I couldn't remember ever not being within a half hour of cities. Nyc flashed me a wicked grin.
Yes, there was a beacon in the bike that is linked to this tattoo.
She showed me a small dot on her outside left palm, dropping her glamour to do so.
It gets warm when I'm headed towards it. Nothing major, and I can ignore it, but when I want to find the bike, it pops up. My tattoo artist has multiple skills.
So I see. I'll need to visit her someday. I'd never really been drawn to tattoos, but some of the magical ones that Nyc had fascinated me. We kept walking, getting quieter as we practiced walking in the woods. More than one animal would stop and linger as we passed, then dart away. I saw trees, rocks, mud, lichen, birds, and more bushes than I could name, but I didn't see anything suggesting there was anyone else out here. Nyc hadn't pulled her glamour back up, and I enjoyed glancing behind and seeing her green form and smooth muscles. Out here, she looked like she could fade into the trees.
It's getting dark. We need to make a camp now before it is dark,
she said sometime later. I managed to muffle my sigh of relief. I had thought I was in decent shape, but 4 hours of hiking proved to me that not only was I distressingly out of shape, but confirmed I knew nothing about the woods. As far as I was concerned, we'd been walking in circles for hours. Okay, where? I looked around, seeing only rocks and tree roots that looked horribly uncomfortable.
This way. I think there's a small clearing and a ledge.
Nyc had taken off ahead, and I followed willingly. Laying down sounded wonderful. I'd been eating and drinking a little as we walked, so I wasn't horribly hungry. But I did want to rest. The new boots were eroding my skin even through my thick socks. She pulled me up over a rise, and sure enough, there was a small clearing where a large tree had fallen, taking out a few others. Nature hadn't had time to overwhelm the spot yet.
This will work. Give us wood for a fire, and we can put the tents against the tree.
She glanced at me, and I must have looked exhausted.
Why don't you start a fire circle, and I'll get the tent set up and gather some wood.
Not much I knew to do, but only because the trailhead had featured a very blunt board about how to build one. Forest Service instructions were usually matter-of-fact and to the point. By the time I was done clearing dirt out in a large circle, enough that we didn't have to worry about sparks jumping, Nyc was finished. The tents were up with air mattresses blown up, bags inside, and she was bringing over an armful of wood. In a few minutes, with some matches and toilet paper, the dead wood was burning merrily. Just the sight of it helped my exhaustion.
You'll get your wish to camp under the stars tonight,
Nyc said, pointing up. The clouds had disappeared, leaving a crystal-clear sky and a crescent moon shining above us. I smiled, seeing more stars than I knew existed. Nyc expertly pulled out one of the collapsible pans and poured water into it, heating it up. I let her, because I was positive that if I tried to do anything, I'd make a complete mess. Faster than I would have believed possible, we had mugs of hot soup and crackers. It wasn't a gourmet meal, but it did taste good.
This is a snipe hunt, isn't it?
She asked. I lifted my head from my contemplation of my empty mug. I don't believe so, though. I shrugged. I underestimated the wilderness. I thought this would be easier, but that was hubris on my part.
I'm just wondering what we are going to do when we find him. Call Alder?
My plan is to figure it out as we go. It isn't like this is a situation where you know exactly what to do. Besides, if we stay out here long enough, you may be carrying my limp, exhausted form out of here in your arms. She snickered, which started me snickering, which led to full-blown laughter. Our amusement filled the air with laughter, and for a moment, I couldn't imagine any other place on Earth I wanted to be.
Chapter 31. Nyc. I had slept in worse conditions, but I had a much harsher upbringing than Stel. I'd worried he'd be too uncomfortable to sleep. Much to my amusement, he crawled into the sleeping bag and was out less than 10 minutes later. By the time the fire was banked and I had made sure our supplies were secured up a tree, I was ready to crash. The forest had stilled as those who hunted at night woke up. A long, low howl rang through the night, and I smiled. I figured it was a wolf, though it might have been a coyote. The range of various animal sounds were not something I knew. I slipped into the tent and pulled off my boots, then crawled in, the bag wrapped around me like a warm hug, and I found sleep quickly. A loud snuffle pulled my eyes open, and I looked up at the interior of the tent. I'd put my head to the back of the tent out of paranoia. I sat up slowly, looking at the front. something pressed against the front tent opening. It took me a minute to figure out it was a nose snuffling at the zipper. Shit, I muttered, and wiggled out of my bag as quickly as possible and pulled on my boots, glad I hadn't removed anything else. The noise was all the animal needed to verify where I was. The next minute, a huge paw raked through the front, shredding it and collapsing the tent around me. Our second-level magic still worked, even with Stel asleep. I grabbed a dagger from the underside of my arm, feeling it appear in a moment in my hand. I sliced open the tent, struggling to get free from the clinging fabric as the bear roared. "Stel!" I bellowed, relieved that a quick glance showed his tent undisturbed so far. I managed to get my shoulders out of the tent fabric before the bear reoriented on me. I shoved the remains past my hips and scrambled backward. I fell as my feet tangled in the slippery fabric of the tent. That saved me from claw marks as a huge paw swept through the air I had occupied not a moment before. My heart rate was through the roof as I crab-crawled backward. The bear, big and brown was all I could tell, rose up on its hind legs and roared. "Nyc?" I heard Stel say. The note of confusion in his voice meant he didn't have a clue as to how dangerous the situation was. His white blonde hair stuck out of the tent as he looked around. "Stel, get out of here!" I all but screamed as I somersaulted backward and came up on my feet, dropping the knife to pull my Zweihander off my arm. "Oh, shit!" His cry was all I heard as the bear lunged at me. The night was dark, the light low, and the fallen tree didn't let me back up any farther. I ducked another swing of a paw and claws that looked like it could take off my face. That removed the last bit of hesitation I had. I swung my Zweihander with all my strength into the bear's side, hitting at the shoulder. I'd never fought an animal before, and the incident at Lester and Brian's had been my third true sword battle. All the people I'd fought had only worn clothes, which made my blade cut through with ease. Fabric allowed my sword to cleave into bone and through it. Rib cages didn't stand up to me swinging this sword. The bear's thick fur, on the other hand, was not as easy. My blade sank in about an inch or two, and the bear screamed. At least I think that was what it was. But rather than running or backing away, it seemed to make it truly mad. In the few spare seconds I'd had to think, I'd been trying to figure out if it was a random bear, or one controlled by Victor, or if it was Victor. That roar and the sudden change in behavior convinced me it had been a controlled bear. Before, the moves had been slow, not like super slow, just slow enough I could move and avoid, almost sluggish. Now I'd pissed the bear off, and there was nothing slow about it. It lunged, snapping at me with teeth that seemed big enough to take off my face. I hate to admit it, but I squeaked, diving to the side to avoid it. Trolls attacking me didn't bug me, but seeing that mass of fur and teeth come at me was scary. I managed to wrench the sword back out of the bear before it dropped to all fours to attack at full speed, and since I was already on the ground, I managed to roll out of the way. The branches and stones around the area gouged into me, but they didn't matter as the bear spun, following me. I kept rolling, trying to get far enough away I could scramble to my feet, but it was so damn fast. Each roll barely avoided the claws coming at me. "Yo, bear! Over here!" Stel yelled. It did no good. The bear didn't even look his way. I got my chance to stand when the bear stood up. I flipped up to my feet, my sword held up at an angle off to my right side, my hands white around the grip as I waited for it to move so I could attack. "I'm sorry." Stel's voice was quiet and sad. I had no idea what he was talking about. The bear rose on its hind legs. In the panic of the moment, it seemed huge, but part of me registered I had to look down to see its eyes. It had its lips drawn back from fangs that I swear glowed in the night. I braced, trying to figure out the best way to move. There was no way for me to resist a full-out attack, so I had to cut as I got out of the way. There was a strange gurgle, and the bear stood there, frozen for a moment. Then it just crumpled like all its bones had been turned to jelly. The forest went silent. I stood there, my heart and rapid breathing all that I could hear. I stared at the bear, but it didn't move. Slowly, I let my eyes shift away from the bear to look at Stel. He stood in front of his tent, a look of sorrow on his face.
It's dead.
Swallowing, I lowered my sword. I didn't ask anything. I just looked at him.
I really didn't want to kill it. It wasn't Victor, was it?
The note of hope in his voice hurt worse than the scrapes and cuts I had covering me. No, it was a real bear, but I'm pretty sure Victor had been controlling it. He dropped out when I hurt the bear, its own anger taking over, I think, at least. Stel sighed and moved over, wincing as sock-covered feet stepped on the rough forest terrain. He knelt next to it.
I kind of figured, which is why I didn't want to kill it.
His hand rested on the top of the head.
One more death to lay at the feet of one man.
With the fight or flight rush fading, I stared at the bear. I knew it couldn't be a grizzly, but in the moment it had seemed terrifying. Now, looking at it, I saw it was a large brown bear, maybe 300 pounds and just over 5 feet tall, when standing. I'd been taller, but it hadn't really registered. I moved over and wiped the sword on the bear's fur, removing most of the blood, then put it back on my arm. The magic coursed over it and it slipped back in, leaving traces of blood on my skin. What did you do? He stood, glancing first at me, then scanning the area. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer.
Transfigured his brain into a random mass of cells. I didn't even change them. I basically placed them in a blender.
The visual made me shudder, but it was effective. With no brain, the bear lay there dead. I echoed his sentiment, but I was rather glad I wasn't going to find out how well I could fight a bear.
You're bleeding,
he said, and I looked at him, then my arm. No, it's just bear blood. Stel shook his head.
I can smell it. You're bleeding. Let's get the fire going so I can look at your wounds and then plan our next move.
Chapter 32. Stel.
She got the fire set up, and I pulled out our minuscule first aid kit. Once she sat down with the firelight on her back, I could see the dark spot where blood seeped from her. You'll need to remove your shirt for me to tend to these, I said softly. Nyc just shrugged and pulled off her shirt, then her tank top. I swallowed and ignored the beautiful body that sat before me. Her skin glowed in the firelight, the strength and curves that I wanted to worship. I was a gentleman by all that I held dear, and I would act as one. By a force of will, I focused on the damage done during the fight. She had a few deep cuts and perforations from the scrabble across the floor, but nothing that was life-threatening. It took me 10 minutes to clean her wounds thoroughly and make sure the blood had stopped flowing. Only one required significant attention, but 2 butterfly bandages later, she just looked like she'd been attacked by a cat, not a bear. The trash I threw into the fire. My back turned as she redressed. I didn't say anything as I heard her digging through the remains of her tent. We need to go. If there are any more bears or other animals in the area, I'll use them if he can. Her voice was quiet, and when I turned, I noted she had most of her possessions repacked into her backpack. The tent lay there in a shredded testimony to the attack. I don't know what to do with this, other than wrap it up. If we make it out alive, we can try to find it to throw it away, but I think we need to find him soon. Except we still do not know his location, I said softly, turning back to stare at the fire. The rage in me at anyone hurting Nyc surprised me. At the same time, it seemed right to find her injuries unacceptable. Hurting her was just repugnant. But hard on the heels of that emotion was the loathing at killing innocent creatures. I had hesitated. I'd found the idea of killing an animal that had nothing to do with any of this offensive. But when I saw Nyc standing there, looking like she'd already barely escaped with her life, and the bear about to attack, there had been no doubt as to what I would do, what I had to do to protect her. felt violated. Killing someone with lasers was one thing. This was something I'd never done. I'd known it was possible to reach into a body and corrupt what the gods had created, making something that was almost magical in its form and function into a mismatch of flesh that was indistinguishable from chopped meat and just as lifeless. But to actually do it altered something deep in my soul I had not realized could be damaged. I detested what had occurred.
I don't think we'll have to worry about that, she said quietly.
I pulled my attention away from the fire to look at her. She wasn't looking at me. Instead, her gaze was locked on the surrounding area. I pivoted, putting my back to the fire, and looked into the trees. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but once I did, I had to fight not to step backward. If I had seen a scene like this in a horror movie, I would have laughed a bit, amused. But staring out now and seeing dozens of eyes reflecting the light back at us, my skin crawled. I could make out a few deer, but the eyes were in the trees, the brush, on top of the log. They were around us, surrounding us. I really don't want to kill that many, I whispered, my gut clenching and bile rising into my throat. It'd be required to target each one individually. If they're moving, I don't know if I can lock onto what would be required to incapacitate each one, and that is a lot of magic. The words were bitter in my mouth, and tears burned at the back of my eyes at the concept of that much death, that much waste. A tremor passed through me, both emotional and physical. I needed sugar, and soon.
I don't think they're going to attack. They're going to herd.
She pointed across from the fire, where there were no eyes glaring back at us. Oh, I wanted to ask more questions, but a few of the eyes that had to have been deer, judging by their height, shuffled forward. I think we need to go.
Yes.
Nyc helped me pack everything back up, wrangling my belongings in place in a quarter of the time. I made sure to fill my pockets with candy bars and nuts. Minutes later, I had the backpack on and she was stamping out the fire. We stood there, waiting for our eyes to adjust to the dark night, the moon having moved out of the immediate overhead sky. We glanced at each other, then moved out, walking slowly across the dark forest. I had believed my night vision had always been excellent. I learned as we trudged through the grasping branches and treacherous roots that there were worlds of difference between walking through an unlit apartment or a darkened city street, as compared to moving through a forest in the dark of the night. From the number of times Nyc muffled a sound or stumbled as we moved, she wasn't much better off. Our speed was that of a slow crawl, but the animals were still there as we moved. As our path was the only clear one, I couldn't get a good idea of how many creatures he had grabbed for this, but the number has been well over a dozen. The range was incredible. It made me wonder if the various animals in the city and forest as we hiked had also been under his control.
Where do you think he's taking us?
Nyc asked. She didn't keep her voice low, and I almost shushed her. Then I realized if he could hear through the animals, it made no difference. Their hearing was much better than either of ours. I'm not sure. This is an unusual way to do it, but it does prevent us from wandering around the woods for hours. I heard a snicker from behind me and smiled to myself. As long as I could elicit happy emotions from her, I would consider myself satisfied. We kept walking as the world slowly began to turn gray around us. There wasn't any fog, the air too cold for that, but the walking suddenly became easier. I took a moment to inspect the ground. We were walking on a trail, not horribly well worn, but more substantial than the few game trails Nyc had pointed out to me. Nyc? I pointed to the ground and she grunted.
Yeah, seems like we might be getting close. In fact, stop.
I did and turned back to look at her. She pivoted in a circle, her body on a razor edge of violence, with both feet on the ground and her hands ready to grab a weapon.
It looks like our guards have mostly vanished.
Mostly? I looked as well, but didn't see any of the animals that had followed us so soundlessly. Part of me had wondered if he had illusionary abilities as well. In the woods, that power would be terrifying. He could have made a fortune as a special effects engineer.
Look up,
she said. I did and saw a bird, a crow if I had to guess, and a squirrel watching us. Ah, No armed guards, but still watchers to ensure we arrive at the appropriate place.
Yep.
I turned and continued walking, relieved as the light made it less treacherous and more interesting. Trying to make out objects in the dark was difficult and tended to be exhausting.
Look there,
Nyc said, and I glanced up. I'd gotten into the habit of paying a lot of attention where I was placing my feet. She had already had to grab me to prevent an inelegant faceplant more times than I cared to admit. Roots actively tried to kill me at every step. Up ahead, a small cabin stood against the mountainside. It fulfilled the need of every horror movie director ever, and there was no doubt that was where we were supposed to go.
Chapter 33. Nyc. I didn't know if I wanted to smirk or roll my eyes. A cabin in the woods. It seemed like someone had taken that out of a Hollywood script. The trail led to the front porch. It was surrounded by trees, and I was pretty sure if you looked at it from any other angle, it would be almost invisible. The 2 dark windows peered out, almost mournful. "What do you want to do?" I asked Stel. The back of my neck itched, and I didn't know why we had been brought here. It didn't make much sense. The cabin couldn't be more than 2 rooms, if that.
I would be delighted to hear any options. Right now, going in, or at least approaching, is the only path I am aware of.
Stel didn't take his eyes off the cabin, his voice somber. "That's what I figured. You good if we need magic? I'm not exactly subtle or anything, and me going in all berserker-like, I'll just destroy stuff." I knew he was the one to figure this out. I just needed to make sure he didn't get hurt in the process. In answer, he pulled out a piece of hard candy and popped it in his mouth.
"I am prepared to do my utmost to protect you, milady."
I just shook my head. He was the one that needed protection, not me. We continued to walk closer, and when we were a few steps away from the cabin, I slipped off my pack. Sword fight with a pack on just hampered my movements too much. Stel went to copy me, and I shot him a look. "Make sure you fill all your pockets with sugar. I can't have you passing out in this wilderness. I never get you down fast enough." Stel started to grab candy bars, but took the time to grin at me.
"I have the faith that should that dire need arise, you would carry me from the forest on your back if it was required."
I turned away so he couldn't see me blush. His level of trust both thrilled me and made me highly uncomfortable. I was not worthy of that level of trust. "We ready?" I asked instead after running my eyes over his bulging pockets, the vest with knives in it, and the serious look on his face.
"I will follow wherever you lead, milady."
A shiver of delight ran through me, and I forced myself not to react. That might not be wise. There are very good odds that if you follow me through that door, we are both going to die.
"Ah, but if we do not, there are even higher odds that agents will continue to die,"
he countered. "True. We ready?" I asked as I set both our packs against the base of a tree. He lifted his hand as if to usher me forward. I pulled out 2 daggers from the underside of my arm. I'd grabbed the one I'd dropped earlier to put it back on. The cabin was much too small for me to be using my 2-handed sword. Nowhere enough swinging room. The feeling of a boulder about to drop on us increased as we inched toward the door. The steps creaked a bit when we put our weight on them, but at this point either it was empty, some poor innocent's house, or we were expected. I stopped at the door, inspecting it, but it just looked like a door. "Look," Stel said, pointing with a dagger. Tucked in the corner of the overhang, almost invisible, was a small camera. A faint red glow toward the back, the only indication it was one, but nothing obvious. "Okay." That made it a bit easier. I lifted my hand and knocked. Stel blinked at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. Could hear it as well as if he'd spoken the words. If he already knows we're here, why be rude? Stel shook his head but didn't say anything. Either way, there wasn't an answer. I motioned Stel back and reached for the door. It was primitive enough there wasn't a knob, just a handle that I pulled on. It opened smoothly and I ducked in, but nothing exploded out at us. Instead, a soft, warm light issued out, one I hadn't noticed from the windows. I leaned over to check the window, and as I remembered, there was no light shining through it. That meant the windows were blacked out. Interesting. I didn't cross the threshold, but looked in. A small table sat next to a small counter with a sink and a cutting board on it. A wood stove was in the corner. The other side of the door held shelving and pantry goods stacked on it. To be honest, it looked better stocked than my cupboards at home. There was a curtain hung up that blocked the view into the rest of the cabin.
Is it just me, or does this look oddly homey?
Stel asked from my left. Homey. I wouldn't mind living here. If I hadn't been herded here by animals, I'd back out and go somewhere else thinking this was a home.
Exactly what I was thinking. But we were brought here. It is only seemly that we continue forward.
I took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold. Nothing attacked, blew up, or screamed at me. It was warmer inside, and I had to resist the desire to relax. Right now, that could be deadly. I listened for Stel, but he stayed on the other side of the threshold as I moved to the curtain and pulled it back with the tip of my dagger. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but a king bed tucked against the wall, a small curtained-off toilet, sink, and clawfoot tub weren't it. But the door set against the back wall was out of place. It wasn't wood. Instead, it was solid steel, almost looking like a door you'd have in a vault, but it only had a door handle. The lever handle looked completely normal, and that freaked me out a bit.
Is it safe enough for me to enter?
Stel called out. Sure, or at least, if there is any danger, I haven't seen it. I didn't take my eyes off the door yet. Instead, I processed everything. There were lit lamps, all running off lamp oil, a pump at the sink, and the toilet was composting, if I was correct. No signs of anything besides a bit of money and good planning, but that door screamed all the things I'd expected.
This place is nicer than I would have believed possible. And you are correct, the windows on the inside are layered with scenes of a sunny meadow, warm and welcoming, and nothing like what lays outside the door.
He stepped up next to me, peering into the living space.
Did you notice the rails on the toilet and the seat in the tub? Whoever this place was fitted for has some level of mobility issues. Even the can opener in the kitchen is mounted to the counter, making it easier to use one-handed. I'm beginning to think this home was simply updated to support someone with mobility issues, not created this way.
I turned to look in the details I'd passed over as meaningless. He was right. I did start to create a different picture when he looked. The closer I looked, the more I saw. All the cups had handles. There were straws. The wood basket was filled with logs, and a cane hung by the bed. The question is, was it for Jane or Victor, or are we being set up? My words rang in the room and chilled my heart. Chapter 34. Stel.
I gave the place one more evaluating glance, lingering on the closed wardrobe and the handmade quilt. Assuming this is not a way to ensure we go down in a manner that paints Duo as the bad guy, then Jane. Nyc glanced at me.
Why her?
I shrugged. The colors, the homey touches, the perfumes near the bath. I can't imagine a bear shifter wanting anything so perfumed as part of his scent. It would be distracting. The door, however, heavy, thick. I'd be surprised if he wasn't the one that installed it. Nyc nodded, looking around.
This place had to have been here before.
There was a question in her voice, however, and I shrugged. I'm unsure if it matters, but this place reminds me of an old moonshining cabin. Something built in the wilderness, far from where anyone would stumble across it, and if they did, you'd mark it in your mind as deserted, about to fall down. But I do not believe we'll know unless we are told.
Which means the door.
My attention had never strayed from its menacing presence, and I nodded. Which means the door. Nyc took a breath, the daggers in her hands, and moved past the cotton, sunflower-covered curtain. I stepped in far enough that the sunflowers dropped behind me like a cloak of happiness. She was within 2 feet of the door when a click resounded throughout the room. I stiffened and dropped into a crouch, ready to move. My abysmal showing with the bear had driven home how much more I needed to work on being ready for the unexpected, and that I needed an exercise routine. At the first movement of the door, Nyc had taken 2 large steps back, daggers at the ready. I held my breath, waiting for something, but all that happened was the door creaked and slowly began to swing outward, each inch making me tense more and more. By the time it was halfway open, and nothing had jumped out to horribly destroy us, I had to stand up and take a breath, shaking the tension out of my body. Nyc glanced back at me. My shaking must have created enough noise for her to notice. She grinned and smiled back. I'm not sure who started laughing first, but we were both suffering from gales of laughter by the time the door had reached its apex. Oh, I needed that. I don't think this will be funny, but that helps. I nodded. Yes. You ready?
With you by my side? Always,
she said with a grin. The flush of pleasure that wrapped through my heart helped to propel me to her side as we both looked through the door. The door led into a tunnel that looked rough-hewn through the side of the mountain, but the timbers that held it up were older than both of our ages combined.
That was unexpected.
Indeed, but I don't think Victor created this, or Jane for that matter. It might have been a family secret. Those timbers are well over 100 years old.
Did they mine up here?
She asked, peering in. I have no clue. I assume so, but the history of the Pacific Northwest is spotty to say the least. I mean, for all I know, it was done by a Yeti. We both snickered at the reminder. The air was cold but oddly fresh, telling me there were at least some vents to fresh air, but that didn't mean there wasn't a risk of cave-ins, just that there was something at the end of this. There was nothing there as we stared. I was about to speak when there was movement in the tunnel and I froze. I felt her stiffen at my side. We both watched the shadow flicker back and forth along the tunnel. The appearance of the shadow pointing toward us let me know there was some light source down there, not just our light going in, which had been my basic assumption. We both stepped back a bit farther, and the leather in her boots creaked as she flexed, getting ready to react. But each flicker of movement didn't reveal anything. I felt that same tension rising up, and I didn't know if bears, wolves, or Victor were about to rush forward. Then 2 eyes glittered at us, about 6 inches above the ground.
Is that a rat?
Nyc asked, her voice disbelieving. It moved forward a bit more as she spoke, and the lights from inside fell on it, exposing a normal brownish rat. It raised itself up on its hind legs and stared at us. It is indeed a rodent genus, I said slowly, trying to peer past it to see what else might be down there.
And here I thought it was a real issue.
She stood, dismissing it. Nyc, I wouldn't, I said slowly.
Wouldn't what?
She glanced at me, confused. Ignore it as a threat. One might not be, even 10, but rats can swarm, and swarms can strip the flesh off of bones in 1,000 bites. Rats are not to be underestimated. I kept glancing back at the rat that just looked at us. It could just be a rat, but I was starting to feel like nothing was just anything in this place. Nyc shuddered. I assumed at the visual I presented, the very idea of them crawling all over me was enough to make me feel nauseous.
No dismissing the rats.
Got it. She took a deep breath, then nodded in a sharp, jerky motion.
We got this. Let me go first, because this is starting to feel like a trap.
I looked up at her. Starting? I was pretty sure it was a trap when I saw the router on the pole by the parking lot. If he had seen Kyoto sniffing around, taking it down would have prevented us from finding anything. Why did he want us here? Nyc shrugged.
No clue. Only way to find out is in.
Lead on, m'lady. She gave me an oddly sad smile. Oh, you might want to flip back to human, I commented. If this place is run by a human, you might startle or confuse them.
Oh, please do not bother. I so much enjoy your rich green skin over the human skin tones. Green fits you much better.
The voice, thick with a Russian accent, boomed through the cabin at such a volume we both flinched back in surprise.
Ah, sorry. I have not tested this much. That should be better.
The sound dropped to normal levels, making the accent richer. I would have expected anger and threat, but instead there was nothing but amusement.
Please, I have been waiting for you, agents of Duo. There is much to talk about. Come.
The rich accent made him sound like an amused Santa Claus. Somehow, I didn't think that was accurate. The voice clicked off, and the rat squeaked and took off, scampering down the tunnel. Nyc and I stared at each other. We were in such deep water that drowning seemed a foregone conclusion. A sigh that seemed to come from the depths of my soul bubbled up. Is it a bad sign that 2 of our 3 cases involve caves? I asked as we looked at the door. Maybe a sign we should take cave investigation training? She offered. Nyc hadn't moved toward the door either. Spelunking? Could be fun. You'd be at a disadvantage, I pointed out. True. She paused and looked around the room, then grinned. Move for a second, Stel. I backed up, then forward. I wasn't walking through the door until I had no choice. Nyc went over and picked up the cast iron tub with a grunt of effort. She waddled over, carrying it and putting it in the doorway. There was no way for that door to close now. We might have to clamber over it, but we'd still have a way out.
Ah, that I did not expect. I am impressed, Orc. Let's see if Duo can impress me further.
Chapter 35. Nyc. I snarled in my mind at the way he said orc. It was a sneer, a curse word, and a put-down wrapped into one. But I'd faced that all my life. It was just a word. I was much more worried about what we faced. I want to grab our packs. There's no telling how long we'll be in those tunnels. Stel nodded at me, and I moved back through the comfortable cabin. This must be what a home looked like. It drove home the fact that I had a place, not a home. Coming back in, my pack already on, I handed Stel his and waited for him to get it on and secured. Ready? I looked at Stel, who smiled, tapping his bag of stuff. I knew he could make things out of the air with me here, but anything that lessened the cost of magic was a good thing. I stepped into the bathtub, then out the other side, tensing as I waited, but nothing happened. I glanced back and nodded at Stel. He followed my example, though his movements were a bit more awkward as he had to jump into the tub then back out. Up ahead, the rat watched us, and I decided to ignore it. It was too much of a distraction when I needed to be checking the tunnel as we walked. It could be laden with traps, obstacles, or anything else. A rat could avoid anything that we would easily trigger. Why do you think he wants us here? I asked Stel, who moved behind me silently. My eyes never quit tracing the floors, walls, and ceilings of the tunnel, looking for anything that caught my attention even for a moment. Stel didn't reply for many steps, until I'd almost forgotten I'd asked a question. I believe Victor needs our regret at what happened, and since Alder isn't here, we are the ones that need to acquiesce to his need for vengeance. The words were said carefully, as if each word had been weighed and measured. A flicker of movement caught my attention. The rat. A reminder that even without hidden electronics, we were probably being watched and listened to at every moment. I wanted to ask so many questions, but first I noticed the air had warmed up a bit. Not so much that it was uncomfortable, but enough that I wasn't shivering. Stel, how are hot springs formed?
Oh, generally they are water heated by magma under the surface of the earth. It depends on the area you are in and how close the magma is to the surface, which determines the temperature of the water.
I could feel his questioning look at my back. The tunnel had seemed straight, but when I glanced back to check on Stel, I could no longer see the door or the brilliant white tub, which meant that either we were moving up or down, or it curved. Anything was possible, as I could only see about 15 feet ahead before the dimness made it unknowable. And these hot springs, Bagby? Another silence, then a short laugh.
I'm uninformed. I would assume the same as most, but I have no specifics. Why?
Just curious. Did you notice the air is a bit warmer? I didn't know why I was focusing on this, but it made me itch.
Yes, and I, for one, am getting a bit warm in our gear, but the desire to remove it is most assuredly lacking.
There was a bit of amusement in his voice, and I had to agree. Not having our supplies right now sounded like a surefire way to die. I was very glad I still had a backup weapon or two, but they weren't ones I could use while in a berserker rage. They required more thought than I could process in that state. I was nothing more than a hack and slash at that point. The light in the tunnel ramped up slowly, and I saw that Stel had been right to tell me not to dismiss the rat. There were more now that the shadows had lessened. Not many, maybe 6. But if there were 6, there might be 60 or 600. Just the idea of them crawling on me, biting and scratching was enough to make my skin crawl. If we got out of this fine, I'd probably have nightmares about the idea. And if it happened? Stel? I knew Victor was listening, but it couldn't be helped.
Yes, milady?
His soft, genuine tone made me smile, though I didn't dare look back. He might see my dopey grin. How many rats would it take to overrun me? I kept my tone light, just curious. I mean, assuming each one I hit would die immediately. I watched a rat as I said that, but there was no reaction, and I had no idea if that was a good sign or a bad one.
You? At least a few hundred. They would need to get you on the ground, if I'm correct. And note that I am not a rodent expert. They would have a hard time killing you if there weren't thousands. Your skin is tough. You have a jacket on, and just rolling over them would kill them. I believe that while they could annoy you, they would require considerable numbers to be capable of severely incapacitating you.
That made me feel better, and I smirked at the rat. I could handle that.
I, on the other hand, would only be able to resist a few hundred. My skin is extremely fragile in comparison to you, and there is a very real possibility that any rat would survive me rolling over it. If I have any option in this matter, I would prefer not to test this theory.
Bile rose up at the very bleak image of Stel dying like that. For a minute, I thought I would throw up. That would be bad. Let's not do that.
Agreed. I would prefer my bed surrounded by grandchildren, please.
He said with a voice that almost sounded like a prayer, but that part of it was missing. I might have followed up on that comment, but the tunnel was changing. The tunnel up again was solid stone, but bright light was coming from my left. I slowed as I approached the light, peering at its source. Where everything we'd walked through had been tunnel, old and hand-dug, this was a wall of thick plastic ribbons, like what you would walk through to get into a freezer. I tried to look between the ribbons, but all I could make out was white. I inspected the opening, but no matter how I looked, the only thing I could see was the ribbons connected to the ceiling with eye hooks into bracing timbers. I looked over my shoulder at Stel, who was a foot or so behind me waiting. He nodded, and I smiled. He always had my back. I needed to remember that. I slipped off my pack, leaving it just outside the ribbons. If I needed what was in my bag, I could dive through and grab it. But if I needed to fight, I wanted the freedom of movement. The pack would get in the way. Stel mimicked my actions and placed his on the ground, and then tapped the pocket our coins were in. I nodded, accepting what he was telling me. If we needed to, he would flip the coin and set me loose on whatever might be inside. I really hoped there was no more bears or big cats. That would be bad. And Berserker, I don't know if I could take a cougar. Besides, killing innocents turned my stomach.
Aren't you coming in? I'm waiting for you.
Victor's voice came through almost like he was in the next room.
I'll be here every step of the way,
Stel whispered behind me. I don't think the rat could have heard his soft comment. I took another steadying breath as I accepted the fact that I could be walking into my death. I stepped through, both daggers in my hands. Chapter 36. Stel.
Nyc pushed past the hanging plastic, and I gave her 4 heartbeats. My heart rate was up, so my normal 2 had increased to 4. When I didn't hear anything, I followed her. I had multiple options in mind. Floor to glue, cellular structure to mush, clothes to acid. The question would be which to choose and how quickly I could change the cellular structure into what I wanted. All of that vaporized from my thoughts as I saw the room laid out before us. Watching James Bond movies had never been my favorite, but my cousin loved them. This would have been a Bond villain's lair. The hours and work that must have gone into it were obscene, yet nothing I saw couldn't be done by elbow grease and the proper application of money. It was a cavern that had been turned into a home of sorts. The floor had been smoothed out and polished and was covered with various rugs, none of them from animals, I noticed. There was a small decorative pool set in the floor at the far end that bubbled with steaming water. That water made the temperature in here a nice 70 degrees or so. A couch, comfortable chairs, and a table met my eyes, each of them screaming of comfort and craft. If I had to guess, they were all handmade. The table was obviously redwood with uneven edges and a brilliant resin of dark green running through it. I spotted a long counter with a sink featuring a hand pump, a wood stove with a pipe that ran into the wall, and cupboards. All of that made it look like something that could have been in an architectural digest, with neat, clean, but simple looks. What threw it off was the far corner of the room. There was a hospital bed hooked up to IVs, with batteries tucked under the bed. Next to it was a sister to the claw tub Nyc had moved, yet what my eyes couldn't move away from was the woman lying in the bed.
Go ahead. Go look and see how little Duo thinks of its agents. What Alder regarded as acceptable losses. Be aware, you may end up in the exact same place someday.
Victor's voice was low, calm, but the undertone of anger scored each word. If they had been knives, we would have been flayed alive by them. As if drawn by an invisible tractor beam, Nyc and I approached the figure. Even all the suspicions I had as to what had happened didn't prepare me for what I saw. I heard Nyc make a muffled gasp as she peered down at what had been Jane Doe. There had been pictures of her in the files. She had rich brown hair, sparkling green eyes, freckles across sun-kissed skin. According to the files, her height was 5'6" and her weight 180. Lots of curves and smiles. My impression of her had been someone you'd just like to be around. Not gorgeous, but full of life. The woman lying there still had brown hair, though it was flat and dry, cut off in areas to make way for cords to attach. The tip of her nose was gone, as was most of her left ear. I couldn't see the right side. Her hands were laying on top of the green blanket that covered her. Most of her fingers were gone on her left hand. The base of them was black, and an unhealthy green crept up her hand. Her right hand still had an index finger from the second knuckle down, but there also, the black and green were creeping, and streaks of black and red were crawling up her arm. Though the blanket covering her was thick, it was obvious from the visible collarbones and the sunken form that she was a shadow of what she'd been.
Do you like what you see? She lost her right foot. I had to cut off her left from the knee down as the gangrene wouldn't stop. She stopped talking and eating about 7 months ago. After the first year, I thought she was getting better. We were building a life here. But one day while I was gone, she went outside to get wood and fell. I don't know how long she lay out there on the snow. The frostbite came back with a vengeance. And this time it won.
There was a choked sob, and he abruptly cut off. The timeline now made much more sense. All I knew about frostbite was it was deceptively nasty, and from what I could see, it had turned to gangrene. Everything about this case made me want to scream in pain and sorrow. I knew the devastation would continue. So many lives destroyed. Victor started speaking again, his accent thicker.
But now I'm assuming brain damage due to infection, as she hasn't spoken since I hooked her up to the antibiotics. She eats and drinks with the tube. I had to put in a catheter. I've become very good at changing them, even cleaning up what little waste she has. Then her period stopped. I didn't know whether to sign relief or scream in rage. At this point, even if she woke up, I don't know that she would have a life again. Alder not only stole her life, but her life, the one we were planning on making.
He paused on a harsh sob, and I looked around trying to see what wasn't there.
I was going to propose to her. I'd hired jewelers to make a ring, and I made everything to be perfect. Then she was abandoned, left to die. I would have never left her behind.
The last words were growled out, and I shivered at the animal behind the sound. There was a wall, a screen really, made of wood that blocked off an area. I turned slowly, trying to see it. There were hangings on the wall, large tapestries that could have come from Russia, what with the Bolshevik clothing styles. They warmed up the place both physically and visually, but two of them fluttered the tassels at the bottom. So how does killing other agents and making their families hurt change anything? Nyc's voice startled me out of my focus, and I cringed. Interacting with him would not turn out well.
It won't. It just spreads the pain and helps to prepare for when my vengeance is ready.
There was a brief chuckle.
I must commend you on your word choice. It is indeed vengeance, not revenge. There's only justice for what was done, what was left undone, and you two will help pull the trigger.
I didn't want to go there, still trying to figure out what to do. The only thing I was sure of was that being near Jane was the safest place to be. Victor, explain to us what happened. I offered carefully. He had motivation and cause, but why so long? It had been years since this happened.
Besides the obvious, they left her in the snow too long. Frostbite. But we removed the dead areas and I still loved her. The damage to her face and body didn't make a difference. We created a home here in this cabin her family had built decades ago. She was getting stronger. Then she wasn't.
The odd note of confused sorrow pulled at me, and I couldn't help but grieve for him. Finding her dead might have been a cleaner ending. Nyc didn't speak, just kept watching everything, but her eyes were drawn back constantly to the wretched creature in the bed. I would not want that life ever. What about Lester and Brian? They obviously cared. They kept reaching out to you.
Them!
Victor spit out the word. If he had been in front of us, I would have checked for acid burns. There was that much venom in the word.
They acted like they were friends. They sent me money, but I didn't respond for years, just took their guilt offerings. But finally I decided to go see them. I needed...
His voice trailed off, and I waited, attuned to the note of sorrow and confusion.
She'd taken another turn. The infection had spread. Nothing I did made her better. How many more body parts will I have to cut off to save the woman I love?
My heart clenched. Those last words weren't said in a sob of loss and love, but a howl of rage. Chapter 37. Nyc. If he had been in front of me, I would have braced for an attack. There had to be a place he was hiding, but small speakers were easy to place and didn't require much electricity. The howl of rage stabbed right through me, and for a moment, I understood his loss, his rage. But none of that justified the death of so many. Poor Emily hadn't even been involved in that case. So, what happened? Stel asked softly, consideration in his voice. He had to be the one to talk to Victor. If I asked, my words would probably come out as an attack. I tended toward too blunt.
I went to them, poured out my heart. I asked for help.
The way he said it told me he never asked for help. Too strong, too proud. How desperate he must have been to actually ask for assistance.
And they said no?
Stel guessed or prompted, but I didn't think they said no. Anyone who would have tried that hard to contact Victor would never have said no.
Oh, they promised to help, but then after dinner, I was leaving as I knew I needed to exchange the batteries running the machine. Brian commented that maybe it was time to let her go. That surely life like this wasn't a life worth living.
I saw Stel close his eyes and his shoulders sagged. I understood. I did. I have sympathy for everyone involved. Victor, Brian, and Jane. I knew how Victor had reacted to that comment. We'd seen the results of that remark.
How dare they? She is the love of my life. I cannot enjoy life without her. I ripped open their throats as they stood there. False friendships are worse than enemies. But it felt so good. A small measure of what was owed me. What was owed Jane had been paid. And I knew that was the answer.
He was snarling now, and part of me grieved for everyone, and part of me raged that his own grief was more important than the grief he caused others.
That is when you started killing?
Stel said.
You hacked into the database and pulled them down and created a kill list. You think you are so smart, little man?
Victor said, contempt in his voice, his accent getting thicker with his anger, turning W's into V's.
I entered through a back door regularly, to see who they had suckered into this little gang, to see where those I blamed might be. I had the data for a while, used it to verify where my false friends lived. Now I could see why I had kept a watch on them all these years. Now I knew the true reason. It was so I could extract the same amount of pain and blood as they had taken from me. At the end, Alder would pay for this. It won't make my Jane better, but she'll cross Smordina knowing her blood debt has been paid.
I see. I must admit, I'm astonished your powers still work with her unconscious. Stel said idly, and I glanced at him. Where was he going with this? I put my arms down and began to walk around, trying to see what else was here. The bathroom was just that, a toilet and a sink. In fact, the toilet was again compostable. It struck me as contrary how much he protected the environment, yet had no issue killing people. He cleared his throat, and I could almost hear his teeth grinding together. A shaky breath came out over the speaker, and his accent smoothed out.
It is what tells me she is still there, that not all of my Jane is gone. We had just gotten to my controlling animals and our people when they left her to die. Together, after we learned how to direct and use each other's powers, I flipped the coin and I can be both of us. I assume she would have been able to do the same. Being able to control through drones and people is exhausting but doable. We could have been the most powerful agents duo has ever seen. Instead, we were thrown away.
I bit my lip at that as I circled the room. A breath of fresh air touched my face as I continued to walk. I didn't stop, but noted the large tapestry on the wall where the air had come from. Another musky scent caught me, strong, and I couldn't really place it.
And what is the price? Is it worth it?
Stel had gone over and picked up a hairbrush and was gently brushing Jane's hair as he spoke. I didn't know if it would make any difference, but I had to admire his ability to keep Victor talking. It would have been very useful right now to have telepathy.
Any price to get vengeance on those who did this is worth it. So it doesn't matter. We would pay it 1,000 times over.
Even I could tell he was citing something with that comment, but I supposed it didn't matter.
So, what now?
Stel was now rubbing lotion into her hands, acting like a concerned caregiver. At least, I thought it was an act.
Are you sure you don't have any more questions to ask? Anything else that you need me to explain?
There was a mocking note to the voice that had me tensing.
You were trying to get us to waste time. What is the endgame?
It is obvious you are the brain to our brawn, though I find it odd that you are also the pretty one.
Victor heaved a sigh, and I wanted to scratch his eyes out. Stel, however, didn't react at all.
You have made it so I can't continue to whittle away at Alder. When you found my drones, I knew I had to change it all. So I simply activated what I've always had in place.
And that would be? How did Stel remain so calm and collected? I wanted to scream in rage, but I tried to do my job. The only thing I'd found was the tapestry that let loose a breeze. I moved to a point in the room where I could run directly at it and hopefully the madman that had caused all of this.
You mentioned earlier about the magma and water. What you didn't mention, or perhaps didn't know, was that most of the passageways are along fault lines. Minor ones, where a small 2.0 earthquake goes unnoticed by anyone except the USGS. But if there was a major earthquake, who knows what would happen? These lines go from here to Mount Hood all the way up to Mount St. Helens. I was sad to realize I'd missed her explosion. The fury of nature always appealed to me. I can't cause enough sorrow to make up for what my Jane has suffered, but this will be a start. This way my path to Smordinia will be paved in blood.
What are you going to do? Stel had turned white and stopped taking care of Jane, carefully drying the lotion from his hand.
First, I'm going to watch both of you die. Then the explosives I've placed in the fault line months ago will detonate. I started the timer when you crossed into the room. The damage should change the world, if I'm lucky. It seems an appropriate tribute to my love.
He paused, and I tried to get my heart to start beating again.
Let me see. Ah, yes. There are 15 minutes left. That should be just enough time.
A strange sound had me jerking around to peer at the tapestry as it moved. Chapter 38. Stel.
I couldn't stand there and twiddle my thumbs while the madman talked. Taking care of Jane seemed like the strongest option and had the bonus of producing rapport between us and Victor. I kept prompting him with words and listening to the whole story pour out. My heart broke for all of them, but in no way did it justify what he had done or was going to do. When he dropped the bombshell of the explosives in our situation, I wanted to howl in frustration. How in the world were we to stop this? With only 15 minutes? I had no idea where else he was, or the control methodology for explosives. For all I knew, this area could be full of tunnels. But that didn't make sense. He'd never leave Jane to die alone, which meant he was nearby. "Stel!" Nyc's cry had me spinning to look at her, and then in the direction she focused on. The tapestry I'd noted earlier was being pushed out of the way by a flood of animals. I had no idea if Victor was guiding them all or not, but to a certain extent I didn't think it made any difference. They were agitated in here, and we were convenient targets. "Did you expect them to kill us?" I asked Victor as they started to flood the room. My brain cataloged them as they tumbled in. Skunks, porcupines, wolverines, badgers, a few wolves, foxes, and so many rats.
Yes, or delay. It doesn't really matter. Either way, goodbye.
I stood staring at the wave of animals as Nyc dropped her daggers and grabbed for her sword, her eyes wide and a flush on her cheek. This was bad, very bad. Everyone would die, and it would all be on my shoulders because I couldn't figure out the right thing to say or ask. "Stel?" Her voice had a choked quality that I understood. There was no clean way out of here. I saw the moment Victor released his hold on them. The animals freaked. It was obvious they felt backed into a corner. We were dead, and so were they. I shoved my hands in my pocket, grabbing candy as fuel for what was going to happen, and my hand wrapped around one of the wires from the prototype. An idea sparked in my mind. Nyc, jump over the animals. Avoid them. Whatever. I'll deal with them. But you must get to Victor. You're the only person that is capable of facing him. I'll follow as soon as possible. I pulled up my phone, bringing up the app as I got everything clear in my mind. What? She'd already had a wolverine lunging at her. She batted it aside with the flat of her sword, but I knew she couldn't do that for long. I couldn't make her responsible for the deaths of so many creatures. Trust me. Go! I put what emotion I could into my voice, even as I began to pull on my magic. There were supplies here, but I didn't have time. I needed these now. Nyc nodded once, and she jumped over them, a wolf spinning to chase her, but the rest of them headed toward me. My magic requires thought and direct energy, but I knew this model, every circuit, every joint. I'd memorized every detail, and I could make it out of nothing with Nyc. I set it into my mind and focused. A shriek of outrage from Nyc distracted me for a moment, and I felt rats sinking their teeth into my boots as foxes snarled, stalking toward me. With the image in my mind, I pulled, making sure my created prototype had a full charge. Creating charged batteries was harder than anything else. The world swam as my blood sugar bottomed out, but in front of me 5 triple-size models appeared out of the air, though I knew it was constructed from the walls of the cave, the dust, and what was in my bag. I dropped to one knee as I fumbled for my phone, hitting punch. The little models turned, and as one began to swing their fists. The wave of animals was diverted, but I needed more. The models wouldn't stand up to much damage. They weren't made of steel and wood. More chocolate in my mouth, and I pulled again. 4 more. Same thing. Both knees were on the ground now, but the moving models grabbed attention. I flipped on the lights, on all of them, and I pulled again. 2. Darkness grayed the edge of my vision, and I grabbed my emergency sugar. I never used this much magic this fast. I knew I approached the end of what I could handle. In my inside pocket were 3 nasal sprays of glucagon. It was meant to hit the bloodstream fast, and I needed it now. My suddenly thick fingers fumbled with the bottle, trying to break the seal, but I managed to place it in my left nostril and squirt. The cold spray hit my nose and then the sugar, pushing the gray back from the edges of my vision. I gave it a 3 count, throwing the empty vial to the side as I did so, and pulled out another one. 3 of the models were in pieces, and at least some of the animals had fled into the tunnel. I was ecstatic that we'd blocked the door open. Hopefully, the idea of freedom was more interesting than attacking us. A bite of pain registered, and I stared at the hand resting on the floor, holding me up. A rat had its teeth in me, and blood welled up. A sharp yip had my eyes floating up to see a fox approaching me, snarling and giving out short, high cries that were not what I expected. I had to move. One more distraction. A violent shake of my hand had the rat flinging across the room. It was hypocritical, but my guilt at killing a rat was much less than the other animals. I placed the next vial up my right nostril. This time it hit even harder, and I lunged to a standing position, staggering to the torn tapestry. At some point, one of the animals must have caught in and pulled it down, revealing a gaping hole in the wall. A wolverine snarled to my right and darted in to attack. My mind didn't have enough coherence yet, and I fell backwards as the creature launched at me, its teeth sinking into my arm. I swallowed the scream of pain. I couldn't afford Nyc coming back. I had to do this. Guilt hammered at me, but with the thought I changed its brain to mush. Quick, effective, and then I stood again, the weight of the wolverine pulling my arm down, but I didn't have time to pry it loose from my arm. I managed to get to the opening and turned, seeing some of the animals glancing at me, some at the little robots, and many at the opening to the tunnel. I managed to get the last nasal spray out and put it back in my left nostril and pushed. The cold hit felt so good. When I pulled it away, there was red on the nose tip. Not good. I pulled on my magic and tried to shove a candy bar in my mouth at the same time. 3 more appeared, each as tall as me, and blocked the entrance, providing the time I desperately needed. I turned and stumbled down the hall, my shoulder against the wall, providing balance. The Wolverine made it too heavy to lift my arm. As I staggered down the passageway, I frantically pushed the sugar into my body. I'd never done anything so extreme, and I knew if that I got to them and Nyc needed me to flip the coin, I'd have to stay conscious. So I needed sugar. A small part of me cursed at not having more glucagon. I could have used a full dozen. A horrid smell slammed into me with the force of a wall. I stuttered to a stop, trying to breathe. My mind sluggishly identified it. Skunk. That explained the shriek from Nyc. I needed to keep moving. There was no time. The invisible clock in my mind ticked down, and terror gripped me at the idea we might already be past the deadline.
Chapter 39. Nyc. I trusted Stel, but the idea of leaving him behind made me physically sick, yet there wasn't another option. I jumped over rats and a fox and made it through the opening into the tunnel where animals were still flowing out. They snapped and snarled, but mostly they wanted out. That was okay. I wanted in. I jumped over a porcupine that looked about ready to explode directly into a skunk's path. Before I could move in either direction, the black and white animal had flipped around and sprayed me. A spray of reeking fluid hit me mid-chest. I yelled in disgust, and for a moment my sword almost cut it in half. I stopped myself and jumped over it, the smell following me like a cloak. I'd probably have to burn these clothes. Alder would pay for the replacements. Skunk. A sound made me spin, and a wolf that must have been following me was pawing at its nose and backing up, whining. It snarled, then went back to pawing. At least something good came out of me smelling like a skunk. I turned around, headed back down the tunnel. The wave of animals, mostly rats, thinned out, and I ran past them. There was a small cavern to one side of the tunnel, and I darted in for a moment, but from the straw and piles of shit, I figured it was where Victor had been storing the animals, though I couldn't smell anything except skunk. I needed to get the smell off me. I clamped down on my annoyance and sprinted back out of the room and toward the light at the distance. This tunnel appeared newer than the original, and that meant Victor must have dug it, or blasted it. I couldn't imagine how long it would take to dig it out by hand. A wide area appeared, full of bright light, and I slowed as I approached it. I stopped before I entered. A curved desk sat at one end, the wall above it covered with screens. Even from the door, I could see the images of the Majestic door, the Bagby Springs parking lot, the outside of the cabin. But what grabbed my attention was the huge man rising up from the chair in the middle of his equipment.
Ah, so you are just like the other agents, leaving a man behind. This is why the entire agency needs to crumble at Alder's feet. He is not fit to command people.
The rich accent matched the man perfectly. At 6'9", I rarely found anyone as tall as me. Basketball players occasionally, but not regular people. Victor was at least as tall as me and wider at the shoulders than Yakul. His dark hair and beard matched every image you would think of for a massive Russian out of the old tales. He wore a tank top with a hoodie over it and sweats, but it was the rage in those dark brown eyes that worried me. I didn't leave him behind. I couldn't stop the protest, even if it hurt saying it. Stel was behind me. He had to be.
Given how you smell.
He smirked at me, wrinkling his nose.
I knew orcs were filthy, so maybe he did so willingly. But you still abandoned him, the small, fragile mage. Look.
He tapped a button on his keyboard, and Stel flashed on the screen. Rats crawling on him and more animals coming. I had to trust my partner. I had to. He will be fine. You need to stop the bomb. Thousands could die. I moved into the room, my sword ready. Victor started taking off his shirt, revealing a thick mat of hair so dark if I couldn't see his pale face, I would have assumed he was dark brown.
Isn't that a lie to yourself? He is fragile, someone to protect, like my beautiful Jane. Instead, you abandoned him seeking glory.
His sweats came off next, exposing legs just as hairy as his arms.
Don't worry. No one will ever know how you died. You'll disappear without a ripple. If I've set this up right, millions will die. Jane and I will be heralded by deaths such as the world has never seen. And it will all be Alder's fault.
With his last words, he began to shift, and I ran knowing my best chance was while he was in between human and bear. But to my shock and horror, he stopped halfway through the shift. Before me stood a creature at least 6 inches taller than me, with claws longer than my daggers. No one had mentioned he could turn into a movie-style werebear. Everything said he was a bear shifter. That meant human to bear. I didn't waste time cussing. I charged. I held my sword up at my right shoulder and started swinging when I was 2 feet away. The blade whistled toward his ribs. A huge paw blocked it at my wrist, batting the sword and me away. I spun, catching my balance before I fell, only to turn to see claws headed toward me. With both hands tight on the hilt, I managed to block the right hand of claws coming down at me, but the left caught me as I went down to one knee. Claws that felt sharper than they had any right to be dragged across my shoulder and down my ribs. I dove away again. I couldn't afford to get close to him. I needed to hamstring him. I dove around him, using the tip of my sword to swipe at his hip as I moved. The blade found flesh, but compared to the damage he'd already done to me, it was a paper cut. I had to be faster. Move faster. Another spin to avoid claws intent on killing me. An irreverent thought flickered through my mind. Lord Bestel should see me now. He'd have no doubt I could dance after watching this. A couple fast steps back as Victor swung at me. Then I lunged forward to slash at an exposed flank. This one at least scored, but I yanked my blade out of his flesh and kept moving. An up-close fight would be in his favor. I needed Stel. There was a chance that in my berserker mode I might be able to defeat him. Maybe. It was our only chance. Victor roared and my body wanted to run. Instead, I moved forward, slashing at his arm. If I could even disable one of them, I had a better chance. My blade snapped off one of his claws, but the others it slid off. I'd been aiming for his shoulder. He was fast, faster than me. Maybe not stronger, but the claws were extensions of him, and I was losing too much mobility trying to fight with only one blade instead of 2. The loss of my cinquereas stabbed my heart. They were the best for dual-wielding, but I had another option. My Zweihander was my favorite. The cinquereas were a close favorite. But I had used the magic Stel gave me and planned it out. The tattoo artist and I had worked for a month to get everything laid out correctly. Then I practiced tapping the right tattoo in the dark while spinning, or doing anything, so I knew where all my blades were regardless of what was going on. With that, I threw my sword at Victor, which made everything in me cringe, but I needed the few seconds. From my left arm, I pulled a handful of caltrops out and scattered them at his feet. He'd kicked off his shoes as he shifted, so they would hurt him more than me. While my right hand did that, my left grabbed the morning star off the top of my right arm. The weight settled into my hand with a sense of satisfaction. I moved as Victor lunged toward me, my right hand scrambling for the Yemen-style kilji under my left arm. Then I needed to switch hands. I was very good with both hands, but I had more power with my right. The kilji was razor sharp and a much better slashing weapon than the Zweihander. Finally set up, I spun, swinging the morning star toward him, and my sanity faded away. Chapter 40. Stel. I staggered into the room. The wall's the only thing keeping me standing. Nyc was fighting with something that looked like it came out of the movies. Standing taller than her, an enormous fur-covered form attacked with a fury that would have crushed me in a single blow. Not my Nyc, though. Blood dripped down her arm, and I could see that she was a bit sluggish on the side,
but she still fought. I watched in horror-struck awe as she attacked and dodged, but even with my lack of knowledge, I could tell Victor would win. He was stronger, faster, unless I did something. I slid to the ground, leaning against the back wall. I took another candy bar out and some hard candies. The effort to unwrap them took too long, but I got them out and in my mouth, crunching down hard. The sugar needed to hit my system as fast as possible. Then, with my trembling hands, I pulled out the coin and flipped it before I let myself think about it. With hands that shook, I laid it on my leg. No matter what, I had to stay conscious. If I tried to use magic or create my laser light, I risked unconsciousness. And that meant we would both die. Instead, I watched, and with what little faith I had in gods or magic or anything, offered obeisance to let her win the day. As long as I could flip the coin back, my death didn't matter. She had to survive. I could see the change as the magic washed over her. Before, her stress had been clear, and her right arm was being coddled. She had been thinking as she fought. Now, it was gone, and I hoped it had been the right choice. Nyc exploded in a flurry of blows, the long, curved, pointy sword in her left hand slashing out, scoring a long, deep chasm across his belly. At the same time, she drove the morning star into his shoulder with a resounding crunch. I couldn't name all her weapons, but I'd watched enough movies about Arthur Pendragon to at least know what a morning star was. I'd have to ask about the other one after we survived. If we survived. How much time did we have? Every minute seemed precious, and I didn't know what to do. As Nyc became a whirling dervish, I tried to get my brain to work. The sugar was making a difference, but I still just wanted to lie down and sleep almost more than I wanted to breathe. Exhaustion had its hooks into me, and I fought not to be dragged down into the darkness. The knowledge that Nyc's life rode on it was all that kept me conscious. It was a brutal give and take. Nyc had multiple gashes across her body. Victor's claws slashed through her jacket, and I could see blood running from her back. But she didn't notice. A fast dive and a backhanded blow I could have never accomplished in 1,000 years shattered Victor's left knee. The roar of pain gave me a little jolt of adrenaline, and I leaned into it, trying to get my brain working. The computers were the answer. They had to be. But how could I figure it out? Victor was slowing down while Nyc still moved like a dervish. The floor was streaked with blood from both of them, and fear crept in that I might lose her, regardless. She had blood dripping from multiple claw marks across her body, even through her leather pants. Yet Victor was hurt worse. The morning star was a vicious weapon. His left arm hung limp, and there were multiple slices across his body. Even as I watched, she slammed the morning star into his knee with an incredible cross-the-body backhand, and he went down. I knew I should stop it now. We probably should take him prisoner. But my hands didn't move. If he healed fast, we'd be vulnerable as neither of us had healing power. Right then I made the decision to kill him, even if Nyc was the weapon I used. My face remained a stone mask as he sank his claws into her thigh. She drove the curved saw up under his jaw and through his brain. The light went out of his eyes, and she yanked the blade out. She pulled back, the claws ripping more as they pulled out of her thigh. Nyc turned, looking for another target, battle madness clear in her eyes. I reached for the coin as she stalked toward me, the lust of blood clear in her eyes. My fingers were thick and clumsy, and my urgent need made it worse. She had gotten to 3 feet in front of me. The morning star raised to crush my skull when I managed to flip it. Nyc staggered and went down to one knee, blood pooling around her feet. "Stel," she rasped out. "He's dead. Get me to the computer. I don't think we have much time." I managed. I'd forced my brain to think, and while I didn't have a plan, I at least had an option. She nodded and slapped the weapons back into her arms. With a groan, she heaved herself up. Then Nyc, my amazing Nyc, offered me a hand. I glanced at the Wolverine still attached to my right arm and handed her my left. "A Wolverine?" Her voice was deep and exhausted, and all I wanted to do was take care of her. But we were out of time. Yeah, later. Computer. I had an idea, but I didn't know if we had enough time. I leaned on her as we staggered to the computers. The one fear I'd had proved baseless, as Victor had no password on the computers, so we were in. I pulled up my phone and enabled Wi-Fi calling. He had Wi-Fi here somehow, probably repeaters. Either way, even though there wasn't any cell service, the Wi-Fi let me call. I dialed Kyoto. He didn't answer. My heart stopped, and I dialed him again. And again. On the fourth time, he answered.
What the fuck, Stel? Didn't you get the hint that I was sleeping?
Kyoto, I don't have time. There are bombs being run by a computer. I'll explain everything later. Please, help.
Stel, are you high? 'Cause this isn't a Mission Impossible script, and I'm not a black hat. Or a white hat, for that matter. I'm just a geek.
Kyoto, please. It's that or millions might die. Can you get into the computer? I was begging, but my arm suddenly sprang up as Nyc levered the Wolverine off of it. Blood oozed out of the holes its teeth had left, but since it wasn't spurting, I assumed no arteries had been punctured.
Stel, you were going to owe me a bottle of very expensive whiskey. I'm talking 4 figures, and if this is all joke, I'm never speaking to you again and will block you everywhere. Can you get into the computer?
Yes. I stared at the screen. There were no hopeful icons labeled bombs or kill everyone.
Okay, Windows? Please let it be Windows.
Yes. I knew it wasn't an Apple, but... Yes, there is a Microsoft flag in the corner.
Phew, trying to walk you through Mac would have been a pain. Now tell me everything you know and I'll walk you through getting me into the computer.
I talked, telling him about a man bent on revenge and bombs in the fault lines that fed the hot springs. But these lines backtracked up and down the Cascades, possibly down to the major faults in California. I was not a geologist. I had no idea if I could set off a ripple effect, but every disaster movie ever said it could, and if he was wrong, excellent. But if he was right, visions of half of California falling into the ocean danced through my mind.
I'm in. If he's controlling them from the computer, it's either a Wi-Fi, cellular, or radio. If you're talking about underground faults, I'd be surprised if cellular can reach. Wi-Fi depends on where and how deep, but my bet would be radio. I'm looking.
Time had gone all elastic on me, and I didn't know if the entire fight had taken 2 minutes or 20. Victor could have been lying, but I didn't get that sense. I think he really wanted to offer up all those lives to Jane and his gods. I wanted to stop that.
Okay, I think I found the program. But still, this is hell of a lot more complex than putting a packet trace on a signal.
Can you shut it off?
I'm trying.
There was muttering and rapid typing.
Shit, he has a countdown clock? What sort of Bond villain is this?
More typing and cussing. If we lived through this, Alder was buying him a case of whiskey and hopefully offering him a job.
Shit, 90 seconds? I swear, Stel, you're so explaining every detail of this.
I will, if we live. I managed weakly. Nyc had sunk to the floor next to me, and the pool of red around her was distressingly large. I was out of sugar. Our packs were at the entrance, though that seemed miles away. The seconds ticked by, and we waited.
Okay, I got 2 disabled. He's got 3. I can't get into the third one. It's like he did that one last or first or something, but it's different.
The rising panic in Kyoto's voice told me he was frantically trying.
Stel, 5 seconds.
I closed my eyes and reached my hand out to Nyc. She took it, placed it against her face, and leaned into it. Neither of us spoke. I just enjoyed her skin against mine. Crap! The whisper of Kyoto's voice matched with a muffled whomp far in the distance. There was a slight wobble on the monitors, but nothing else. We sat there waiting for something else to occur. I had no idea what to do now.
Are you still alive?
Kyoto asked hesitantly. We're alive. There was something, but I trailed off, not sure what else to say. Can you check the news? Is there anything else happening on the West Coast? Isn't there an earthquake site? My brain was pulsing slowly, and I struggled to find words.
Oh, yeah. Give me a minute. I heard rapid typing as I sat there, exhaustion pulling at me like I was sinking into wet concrete. Got it. Minor earthquake in the mountains outside Portland. Some reports of aftershocks down to Klamath Falls, but all under 1.5. No damage. I wanted to cry with relief, but at this point just breathing seemed like an impossible effort. Thanks, Kyoto. You okay? What the fuck was that all about? He sounded worried and stressed. I think we'll live. Maybe. Promise I'll explain later. I lifted my left hand to disconnect and sat there, Nyc's face still against my right hand. You okay? She asked softly, her voice almost slurring. No, but I'll survive. I think. You? No, but not dying today, it looks like. Good. Time to call for backup? Yes. I stared at the phone for an eternity, at least 5 minutes. Then I lifted my hand and hit his contact. Stel, what is going on? His harsh voice lashed out of the phone, and in my exhausted state I pulled back, hitting my head against the headrest, which increased my vertigo and headache. It's done. We need pickup, backup. Come get us. What? Where are you? What happened? I didn't even know how to tell him where we were. Track my phone. I'm going to sleep now. I couldn't fight the pull any longer. The fading adrenaline added weights to my body, sinking me down faster. The last thing I remembered was slipping to the ground and Nyc's warm, sticky leg under my face.
Epilogue. Nyc. I'm not sure how long Stel lay on my lap, or I sat on the floor. Time didn't track for a while. Next thing I really knew, Alder and a medic were standing over us, with Alder tapping my face lightly.
How bad are you hurt?
The medic had Stel up and was placing him on a stretcher. His blood sugar is tanked. Needs more. The medic nodded, and I looked back at Alder. Flesh wounds, sprains, cracked ribs, blood loss, but not fatal. Everyone okay? He frowned.
What do you mean?
While they got Stel out of there, they managed to get me up and moving, even though every inch of me hurt. I led him out to Jane, explaining everything, especially the bombs. He listened, only asking questions once or twice.
Okay, anything else?
He said when I was done. I think Stel has stuff for you, but right now, I shook my head. All I wanted was a shower and sleep.
You did good, Nyc. Let's get you out of here, fed and cleaned up. Then we can go over this again.
I nodded, too tired to even mount a protest. What about Jane? He looked at her with such a look of guilt and grief I had to look away. It was too raw.
We'll take care of her, like I should have from day one. Don't worry.
He took a deep breath, and I dared to look at him. Alder's eyes were still locked on Jane's form.
I can't make it right. I can't undo the choices I made. But I'll try.
I stared at him for a long moment, then turned and followed the people carrying Stel out the door. I stopped to grab our bags as I walked through. I limped down the tunnel, not looking forward to the hike out. To my utmost relief, they had landed a small chopper in the clearing in front of the cabin. A tight fit, but not impossible. I trudged toward it, the bags feeling 5 times heavier than they had going in. My arms probably needed stitches as it still trickled blood, and the dizziness told me I might have made a mistake saying I was fine. Needing a moment and refusing to admit I needed help, I didn't want them to take their focus off of Stel. I braced myself against a tree, heart pounding. That wasn't a good sign. Trying to take my mind off my floaty head, I looked back at the cabin. A flutter of movement caught my attention. An owl with horns and striped feathers sat on the top of the cabin, glaring at me. Its dark eyes burned into me. It just fluffed its feathers up and down, but still watched. Its attention didn't move until Alder came out of the house. It beat its wings and shrieked as it flew away. Alder didn't turn his head, just walked straight to me.
She's being packed up now. She'll receive the best we can give her.
I just stared past him at the top of the cabin.
Nyc?
That was weird. I muttered as my knees turned into butter and ran down my legs, and my vision followed back into the dark tunnel. Epilogue. Stel. Beep, 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 blared in my ear, and I moaned, trying to get away from the sound, but it wouldn't stop.
Oof, fine, I'm up,
I whispered, my head pounded with a pulsing beat. Excellent. I'm glad to see you're awake, Mr. Devani. I'll let Alder know. A cheerful voice spoke to my left. The annoying beeping turned off to my relief. I managed to turn my head and lever up eyelids to watch a blue-clad figure disappear out a door. The white walls mocked me, and I seemed to have tubes connected to me. The memory of the rat and the wolverine slammed into me, and I jerked straight up in bed, instantly checking my fingers and wiggling all my toes. They all responded. I sagged in relief, then went right back up. Nyc! I might have screamed the word, or whispered it, but it didn't matter. Where was Nyc? If she died, I'd never forgive myself. I struggled to unstuck the sheets wrapped around me and convince my legs to move. I'd managed to get the sheets off and my legs over the edge of the bed when Alder walked in. Where's Nyc? Was out of my mouth before he could say a word.
Stel, get back in bed. She's okay. You'll probably see her tomorrow.
He pressed against my shoulder and I slowly gave. My mind started to kick back in and I really looked at him. He looked old. I didn't think I'd ever seen him look old. Alder had always looked rather ageless, caught in time in his later 30s or early 40s, distinguished, competent, and handsome. Today he had rings under his eyes. His face was puffy and his hair looked like he'd spent the last 2 days running his fingers through it. What happened? I looked at what was dripping into me, saline. I didn't see anything else.
You were in hypoglycemic shock. Thankfully, large doses of glucagon helped. Remind me to get you more of those. Apparently, the 3 doses you took barely kept you alive, which would have sent a normal human into hyperglycemia. I shrugged. Fairy blood. The fairy dust has a lot of sugar in it. But go on. You were stabilized pretty quickly. Nyc, on the other hand. My entire body went stiff, and I was about to lunge out of the bed. Alder held up his hand. Peace. She lost a large amount of blood, more than anyone realized. We don't keep half-orc blood on hand, mainly because there isn't any. Which should make you happy, as I've just instituted a new policy. She's okay? Alder glared at me. The policy is that all agents must donate a pint a month until we have enough of their blood on hand to replace their body twice over. It's going out today. Alder, where is Nyc? I said coldly, giving him my best glare. He sighed and dropped into the spare chair. She's recovering. I had to get a mage in here to increase her blood replenishing abilities and fill her up with saline. But she's fine, I promise. Now tell me everything. I leaned back, breathing through my nose to calm myself, and I started talking, explaining everything. When I was done, I looked at him. So, was he lying? What happened? He wasn't lying. He just wasn't an engineer or geologist. The bombs were there, and it was good you got them stopped, or the damage would have been extreme. But steam and other minerals in the water had corroded the connections of the one that wasn't stopped. He must have had them down there for at least a week. Another week and none of them would have worked. As it was just a partial explosion. It didn't move the plates or do much more than widen the gap the water flowed through. You did good. I heaved a sigh. And Jane is receiving the best care in the world. You saved a lot of people. He rubbed his head and rose. I'll send someone in to get this into a report. You two have done enough.
He almost made it to the door before I spoke. Why? He turned and looked at me.
Why what?
I could tell from the shadows in his eyes he knew my question. Why did this happen? I asked him. For a minute I thought Alder wasn't going to answer. Then he looked at me.
Because being a demigod doesn't mean I'm perfect. It simply means when I screw up, the consequences can be catastrophic. This is one of those times. I'll never leave anyone behind again, no matter what.
The words had the ring of an oath, and I nodded, then leaned back as he left. I'd see Nyc tomorrow, and all would be well. I let sleep claim me again with the memory of Nyc's face against my palm. Author's Notes. I hope you enjoyed the first adventure of Nyc and Stel in the Duo universe. Now for the big question. Will there be more for this adorable duo? Honestly, I don't know. If you love this and want to see more, leave a review, get your friends to buy, and let me know I should make the time to write more. The power is in your hands. Yes, I'm an 80s child. Your point? If you'd like to stay in touch, you can follow me on social media at the following places. Website, badashpublishing.com. Facebook, facebook.com, badashbooks. Twitter, twitter.com, badashbooks. Instagram, instagram.com, badashbooks. Bookbub, bookbub.com, profile Mel Todd. If you're interested in free books, keeping up with what is going on in my life, as well as sales and launch announcements, you can sign up for my newsletter at my website. You never know what freebies might show up. Take care. Mel Todd. More duo titles. The Improbable Pair, Sarah Knopf. Hunter's Curse, Kat Healy. Consuming Wind, Kimbra Swain. Revenant's Brigade, Jen Mitchell. Cloak and Dagger, Scott Walker. Split Infinity, Jamie Davis. Whisper and Blade, S.W. Clark. Halo of Light, N.A. Grotepas. Unholy Deuce, Ben Zackheim. PuppetMaster, Mel Todd. Visit the Delta Underground Operatives Facebook page for updates and information.